Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
Elijah awoke shivering in the middle of the night. Winters in the Pacific Northwest could be brutal, and it seemed that his island was no exception. Fortunately, his initial investment into the Constitution attribute had combined with his body of wood as well as one with nature to give him significant protection from the elements. He was still cold. After all, the temperatures had dropped well below freezing, but his experiences told him that he was at no risk of frostbite or other issues related to overexposure. Of course, even if that wasn't the case, he had touch of nature to bail him out, though that seemed like a waste of Ethera. With a groan, he opened his eyes to see an incredibly clear, starlit sky. That was one thing about being stranded in the middle of nowhere. There was no light pollution, so there was nothing to obscure the tapestry of stars. In a way, it reminded Elijah of being out to sea, though even those experiences had been marred by the occasional drone of an airplane or a satellite streaking through the atmosphere. Now, after the onset of Ethera and the transformation of the planet, there was nothing of the sort. And in all the ways that counted, it was both terrifying and objectively beautiful. After all, while there was incredible beauty that had come with the transformation of the earth, it also came with the knowledge that everything people had worked toward for thousands of years had been cast aside in the space of an instant. Elijah had no way of knowing for sure, but judging by the way the plane had crashed, technology no longer worked the same way it had before. No more electronics. No more cars. No telephones or computers. They'd been shoved back into the Stone Age. But along with the dissolution of technology came Ethera and magic. So, hopefully, people had begun to adjust. There was no telling how many different archetypes were out there, and if Elijah's own abilities were any indication, there was plenty of reason for optimism. There was also call for cynicism as well. Elijah wanted to think the best of people, but he was realistic enough to know that they wouldn't always cooperate with that optimistic expectation. Instead, they would act according to their own self-interests. Sure, most people would try to help others, and only a few would turn on their neighbors. But it really only took one person with power to ruin everything. One man or woman who chose to take advantage of those weaker than them could do untold damage, especially with the escalation of power that came with the influx of Ethera. That's what Elijah feared more than anything. A magical tyrant so strong that no one would oppose them. It was a horrifying prospect. Not that it really mattered for now. Aside from his distant neighbors across the strait, Elijah was alone. There was no one to oppress him, save for the environment itself. For a long while, Elijah just lay there, his body still feeling as if it was in a state of flux. Certainly, he could already feel the changes that had come with his neophyte soul. However, he was more than a little afraid of looking at the changes, which seemed extensive, wrought by his heedless pursuit of improvement. In hindsight, his actions had been stupid. He had no idea what he was doing, and because of that, it wouldn't have been surprising if he'd crippled himself. In fact, if he'd had the wherewithal to form rational thoughts while in the middle of his soul's transformation, that was exactly what he would have expected. But against all odds, he'd succeeded in yet another cultivation upgrade. He opened his status. Elijah Hart, level 7. Archetype, Druid, class, not applicable. Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, dexterity, Constitution, 11. 11. Regeneration, 12. Movement, nature, cultivation, body, formed, neophyte. Idly, he wondered what he should do with his future attributes. He'd very much reaped the benefits of having a bigger pool of Ethera and increased regeneration. But he also knew that, without physical attributes, he wouldn't stand a chance against more powerful creatures like the Viridian monster or the panther. He hadn't forgotten how much stronger and faster they were, after all. To stand up to that level of might, he needed as much of a boost to his strength, dexterity, and constitution as he could get. It was a conundrum, and it was one he didn't expect to solve in the near future. Nor did he need to. After all, he hadn't gained a level in a while, and if he had his way, he wouldn't be fighting any more major battles anytime soon. Sure, he got a trickle of Ethera from his crab hunting, but it wasn't nearly enough to progress at any appreciable rate. It would take a concerted effort to change that, and in the middle of winter, he couldn't afford to devote himself to such a thing. Survival was hard enough without adding the danger that came with hunting for levels. So, Elijah turned his attention to the pathways of his soul, and he was more than a little surprised to find that they were completely gone. For a moment, he wondered if the system had gotten things wrong. It had claimed that he'd progressed, and because of that, he'd expected to find a minute increase in the size of the channels that carried his Ethera throughout his body. However, that just wasn't the case. The only thing that kept Elijah from panicking was the fact that nothing really felt wrong about it. So, he tested it the only way he knew how, dragging Ethera from his core and casting nature's bounty. A flood of Ethera poured out of his core, infusing his entire body. A moment later, the spell activated, and when it did, Elijah could feel that the diameter of the area of effect had more than doubled. But it didn't feel any more powerful. So, Elijah let it drop and cast Touch of Nature instead. Before, the cast had taken almost 2 seconds, but now, it only took half that. He tried out his other spells, finding similar results. It seemed that, for his constantly channeled spells, it simply increased the area of effect. For nature's bounty, that was an incredible boon because it meant that he could affect more plants at once. For something like One with Nature, though, the effect was somewhat muted and only really influenced the sensory bubble around him. With spells like Eyes of the Eagle, Storm's Fury, or Snaring Roots, the transformation of his soul merely made them activate much more quickly. Definitely useful, if not life-changing. "You have only begun to walk the path of a cultivator," came a voice from nearby. Elijah didn't need to look up to know that it belonged to the tree spirit. "For now, you are merely setting your foundations." Elijah glanced at the familiar form sitting on the branch. It seemed a little bigger, but it was hard to tell in the middle of the night. Even with the moon and stars casting the glade in silvery light, it was difficult to see more than shadows. "What?" Elijah asked. "The first steps are unique," the tree spirit stated. "You are not truly a cultivator until you have reached the first stages in body, mind, soul, and most importantly, your core. However, you are progressing well, as is proper for the protector of my glade." "Huh," was Elijah's response. "What are you talking about? Protector? I'm just trying to survive here." "You have drawn an ancestral circle around my glade," the spirit said. "Using my seeds no less. When the saplings reach maturity, our bond will be complete." "What bond?" asked Elijah. "It is a symbiotic connection," said the tree spirit. "Your grove will become more powerful, and with it, the speed of your cultivation will increase. However, that power does not come without obligations. You must become my guardian, protecting me from those who would harvest my wood and drink my sap in hopes of growing stronger." Is that possible?" Elijah asked. "It is," the tree spirit responded. "Deplorable and short-sighted though it is, there are those who act as parasites, consuming all they see. Doing so will grant power, but it is fleeting. Harmony is the better path, though it is often slower." Elijah could intuit a little from the spirit's explanation, chiefly that harvesting and consuming natural resources like the tree would grant power, though it would be a one-time gain. And perhaps it would only be temporary, though Elijah expected that that wasn't the case. However, he'd already experienced the effects of cultivating under the tree's branches, so he knew that that was a path to strength as well. Though, according to the tree spirit, it was slower, yet sustainable. The optimal path seemed obvious to Elijah, but he could also see how quick gains might be appealing as well, especially if growing stronger more quickly would mean survival. But Elijah had no interest in quick gains. Nor did he have any inclination to somehow harvest the tree. Doing so seemed abhorrent, and not just because of the effects of his archetype, though it surely influenced him. Instead, his reticence was born of the knowledge that the tree spirit was a sapient creature. Killing it and consuming its power, however that might be accomplished, was grotesque. Still, Elijah understood people well enough to know that he might just be in the minority in that opinion. "What do I need to do?" he asked. "And what should I call you? I don't want to keep thinking of you as the tree spirit, you know." I have never had a name, the tree responded. Perhaps Nerthus. Yes, that name feels right. Nerthus? Okay, Nerthus. Is there anything I need to do? Or should I just keep helping the other trees grow? Also, are they going to be like you? Sentient, I mean? And how do I progress my other cultivation? Like, my mind and core, Elijah rambled. After his ordeal with laying the foundations for his soul, he felt a little giddy, almost like he'd drunk too much coffee. No, you are doing enough, Nerthus said. The saplings may one day develop spirits, but not for a very long time. Regarding your cultivation, I cannot say. I am limited in what information I can give a newly integrated native. Elijah was a little disappointed, but he wasn't really surprised. Nerthus had been helpful, but it had always been limited in terms of what information it could convey. But that was fine. Elijah would have loved to hear more, but he'd been doing okay so far. Mostly. Aside from a few speed bumps like almost getting killed by a huge, scaled monster from the ocean. Which reminded him, "While I've got you here," Elijah said, "a few weeks back I ran into this monster. Or I guess it ran into me. It was huge, scaly, and just felt wrong. Like, just looking at it made me nauseous. Anyway, it almost killed me, but there's this panther who lives in the area, we've got kind of an understanding, and between us, we managed to take it down. But it started to decompose almost immediately. None of the other animals I've killed have been like that. That is because that was not an animal," responded Nerthus. "It is one of the Vox. Creatures from a different realm. They come through portals and corrupt the very land they walk upon. As weak as you are, if you manage to survive an attack, perhaps you will be a better guardian than I hoped." "Where do they come from?" asked Elijah. "Some come from temporary portals," Nerthus stated. "Those are rare. I suspect that is the origin of the one you encountered. However, there are more permanent." Nerthus trailed off, and the entire tree trembled. "I am not permitted to say any more than I have," it stated. "I am sorry, Guardian." Elijah shook his head. He'd have preferred more information, but he understood the tree spirit's limitations. So, he resolved to be happy with what he could get. However, just when he was going to ask another question, the spirit said, "I must rest now. Perhaps when you complete your grove, I will be able to remain longer." I understand," Elijah said. "Thank you." "No, Guardian. Thank you," stated Nerthus, its voice trailing off as it retreated into the branch upon which it had been sitting. Soon, it looked like nothing so much as another knot in the wood. Elijah sighed. He had learned quite a bit from that short conversation. First, it was incredibly important that he continue to try to explore the other facets of his cultivation. He'd already laid the groundwork with his body and soul. Now, he needed to work on his mind and core, though that would take some doing because he didn't even know where to start. Second, he'd learned of the existence of two sets of enemies. There were the people who would want to harvest creatures like Nerthus. For some reason, he expected that the coalition of dwarves, gnomes, and goblins he'd seen across the strait would fall into that category, but he had no real basis for that intuitive leap. Still, with how unconcerned they seemed to be about their environment, it seemed to fit. The other, the so-called Vox, were a far graver threat, probably to everyone, regardless of how they chose to interact with the world. And third, he discovered that Nerthus's existence, as well as Elijah's choice of where to grow his ancestral circle, gave him a significant advantage. He didn't know what form that advantage might take other than to aid him in his cultivation, but he expected that it would be important. But more than the information, Elijah was most grateful for the opportunity to engage another being in conversation. Sure, talking to a tree was a poor substitute for human companionship, but doing so had soothed his mind and soul to the point where he actually felt optimistic about the future. Of course, the moment that thought skittered through his mind, he remembered just how tenuous his situation was. Certainly, he'd managed to find a way to survive, but that was contingent on everything remaining the same, which was incredibly unlikely. For the next few weeks, Elijah fell into a rhythm. With winter tightening its grip on the area, the days shortened and the nights grew longer. However, to his surprise, the cold didn't seem to bother him much at all, which was a good thing, because aside from a makeshift blanket he'd stitched together from rabbit hides, he had little protection against the elements. Certainly, he'd closed the cabin off by piling moss and leaves across a few upright limbs, but he'd never been much for bushcraft. He knew some of the basics, and he could survive passably well, but Elijah knew he'd never be much of a builder. So, his continually decreasing susceptibility to the cold was more than welcome, though he had no idea if it was due to his body of wood or his increased constitution attribute. Perhaps it was both. Either way, it significantly increased his chances of surviving through the winter. Fortunately, the crabs didn't seem to care what time of year it was, so his hunting continued apace. However, he did worry about the lack of vitamins and carbohydrates in his diet. He did what he could to supplement his meals with seaweed that he gathered from the shore, but it was a poor substitute for a balanced diet. When his cache of berries and mushrooms ran out, he'd be in real trouble. Which was why he'd taken to spending much of his day trying to force his garden to grow. It was going well, and the bushes had nearly reached maturity, but it would still be some time before they sprouted anything edible. The same could be said for some wild onions he'd planted nearby. To pass the time while he sat in the middle of his garden blasting the plants with nature's bounty, Elijah busied himself with whittling. It was something he'd picked up from his father, but he hadn't practiced carving in quite some time. Years, in fact, so he was more than a little rusty, an issue that was further exacerbated by the lack of a proper knife. He had his stone-bladed knife, but it was nowhere near as good as working with a steel blade. Still, so long as he went at it deliberately, he could carve something approaching recognizability. His first attempt had been Fremont, the dog he'd been forced to give away, but that had come out looking more like a child's interpretation of a horse. Which meant that the only recognizable traits it bore lay in the fact that it had 4 legs and the proper basic shape. Still, with basic survivability taken care of, Elijah had quite a bit of free time, and he'd have more as winter truly embraced the island. So, he'd kept at it. And day by day he improved. Even as his technique grew more practiced, his focus shifted as well, and he stopped trying to carve figures. Instead, he wanted to replace his walking stick with something a bit more elaborate. Which was how he found himself combing the forest for the perfect material. The hunt hadn't gone that well. The branches he'd found were almost all rotten, and even the ones that weren't were bent too far out of shape to be useful for his purposes. Still, he persisted until he found a wrist-thick branch that had only just fallen from a hickory tree. Elijah had no idea why it had fallen, but he suspected it had something to do with the fact that the base looked as if it had been chewed through by some small animal. Couple that with the winter winds that periodically swept through the island forest, and it wasn't that difficult to figure out. Branch in hand, Elijah trekked back to his cabin and set about straightening it. In the beginning, he only had some vague ideas about how to go about the task, but he did know that it had something to do with saturating the wood with steam. Through trial and error, he'd come across a decent, if a labor-intensive method of steaming the wood, then bending it into the proper shape. Before he'd advanced his strength, constitution, or regeneration, Elijah never could have kept it up for long enough to make the shape stick. And even with his improvements, he was forced to periodically use touch of nature to stave off fatigue. He was also aided by one with nature, which accentuated his physical capability to the point where he suspected that he'd reached the peak of human potential. Perhaps he'd even exceeded it. Whatever the case, it worked, even if it was a grueling process that took days. It would have been much easier if he'd had clamps and proper woodworking tools, but out in the wilderness, that simply wasn't the case. Either way, it was good practice for his spells and an even better workout. After 2 days of working on straightening the stick, Elijah's strength finally ticked over to 10. His dexterity still lagged behind by a couple of points, but he had some ideas about how to remedy that once he finished his staff. Once the staff had been straightened, Elijah set about carving some decorations into it. When he started, he just focused on the process, uncaring about the result. Afterwards, he would liken it to absently doodling. However, it wasn't long before his little stone-bladed knife seemed to take on a mind of its own as it carved fanciful designs in the sturdy staff. Soon enough, it started to take shape, and only when it was half-finished did Elijah realize what he'd taken for inspiration. The staff looked remarkably like the tree spirit's limbs, as if someone had intertwined dozens of small vines into a single structure. At first, Elijah was surprised that his mind had taken him in that direction, but the more he thought about it, the more appropriate it seemed. So, he continued along, Only now he was conscious of the direction he wanted to go. As he carved, a process spanning weeks and consisting of him steadily scraping the barely sharpened stone blade against the wood, Elijah found himself continuing to flare touch of nature. As always, he kept one with nature active as well, and often, it was accompanied by nature's bounty as he coaxed his garden into maturity. Once he'd finished the process, the staff looked almost natural, as if it had been grown rather than carved. In addition, even when Elijah let his spells fall away, it practically pulsed with what he'd begun to consider his own flavor of power, a result of its constant exposure to his Ethera, no doubt. But it needed something else. And Elijah knew precisely what that something was. During his exploration of the wilderness, he'd stumbled upon quite a few beehives. More than once, he'd considered pilfering the honey. Not only would it provide a bit of variety to his diet, but the hive would give him access to beeswax, which had all sorts of uses. However, he'd so far decided against it because he had no apiculture skills. And Elijah had no interest in getting swarmed, even if, from a rational perspective, he knew he could heal whatever damage a few stings might cause. With his advancement in constitution and his body cultivation, the bees might even be incapable of penetrating his skin. Of course, that was assuming they hadn't evolved like the crabs had. Some animals had appeared mostly unaffected by the planet's conversion, but others had been completely transformed. For instance, most of the hares he'd encountered were just normal rabbits, but he'd caught a few glimpses of some rabbit-like creatures that actually had horns. Who knew if the bees he'd stumbled across were similarly transformed? He'd observed them a few times, and they didn't look any different, but there was no way of telling if they had other new defenses. Perhaps they were even more venomous than normal, which was a terrifying thought. It was one thing to get a painful sting, but it was something else entirely if they were suddenly deadly. Even so, Elijah had come to trust his ability to heal, and he'd decided to attempt to harvest one of the hives. To that end, he'd chosen one close to the stream. If they swarmed him, he intended to cut and run, submerging himself in the frigid water until they lost interest. But he hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Using an ember he'd carried from the cabin, Elijah started a small fire at the base of the tree where the hive was located. Then he added green pine needles to make the fire smoke more than normal. Finally, he waved the smoke in the direction of the hive. He only had a vague idea of how it was supposed to work, but he knew that smoking the hive was the most effective method. So, that's what he did, waiting for a few minutes until he scrambled up the tree and, using his stone-bladed knife, cut a huge chunk of the honeycomb away. Thankfully, the bees in the hive were incredibly lethargic, and though he picked up a few stings, it was nothing like the swarm he expected. Before long, he'd filled a shallow, wooden bowl he'd carved with the stuff, and he retreated, using touch of nature to heal the stings he'd received. Easier than expected, he muttered to himself as he made his way back to the cabin. Along the way, he felt the presence of the panther, but he said, "No fish right now, Your Majesty, and I don't think you want to eat beeswax." Still, he left a big chunk of it out just in case he was wrong about cats and their tastes. After all, he wanted to do whatever it took to stay on the panther's good side because he'd seen exactly what happened to things that drew its ire. When Elijah made it back to his cabin, he stoked the fire and placed the honeycomb into a pot of water. Then he set it to boiling. Once the honeycomb had melted, he strained the soupy mess, then repeated the process until, at last, he had a disk of golden wax. Grinning, he set it aside and retrieved his staff. Fortunately, Elijah's father had taught him how to make his own finish, which combined beeswax, turpentine, and linseed oil. While it would have been much easier to simply go to the store and buy the materials, Elijah had learned how to gather and prepare the proper materials from their sources. The linseed oil had been the easiest because flax, especially in the quantities that he needed, wasn't difficult to find. After that, it had been a simple process of drying the seeds, then crushing them. It would have been better to boil the result, but that came with a host of problems, chiefly that it was difficult to do so without the oil combusting. There were ways to avoid that, primarily additives, but Elijah didn't really know how to source them. So, he decided to simply use the raw paste, even if it wasn't ideal. The turpentine had a similar issue in that, ideally, it needed to be distilled, but Elijah had chosen to simply boil it and hope for the best. The results were mixed, but he expected that it would work well enough. With the various ingredients in hand, Elijah added them together like his father had taught him, resulting in a paste that he hoped would seal the wood of his new staff. Sealing wasn't absolutely necessary, but he had time to kill and a desire to do things properly. After creating the sealant, Elijah dipped a corner of his shirt into the mixture and started massaging it into the wood. He went slowly, and it took him most of a day to finish the process. Meanwhile, he continued to use his various spells, almost on instinct as much as because he needed them. Finally, with his hands cramping despite his constant usage of Touch of Nature, he finished. And when he did, he got a couple of surprises. First, the week's worth of carving the staff had resulted in his dexterity increasing to the point where it matched his strength. That was somewhat expected, even if he'd been too distracted to pay much attention to it. However, the second surprise was that the system recognized the completion of the staff with a notification. Congratulations! You have created a unique item, Staff of Natural Harmony. This item will serve to enhance any spells, skills, or techniques with a nature aspect. Grade, simple. W at the. Sitting in the center of his budding grove, where he'd been flaring his nature's bounty, Elijah was dumbfounded. He'd simply meant to carve a cool-looking walking stick, but it seemed that he'd overshot that mark by quite a bit. Excited, he monitored his spell, but its area of effect hadn't grown by a single inch. In fact, it seemed exactly the same as it had before he'd finished the staff. And he knew good and well that nature's bounty had a nature aspect. It was right there in the name. So that meant he was doing something wrong. After a few minutes of frustrating experimentation, Elijah figured it out when he actively chose to channel his Ethera through the staff, as opposed to simply using his body. Instantly, the area of effect associated with nature's bounty grew by almost 10 feet. More than that, though, the associated atmosphere of Ethera felt heavier, denser, more potent. Elijah couldn't be sure, but he interpreted that feeling as the spell being stronger, and not just in terms of its area of effect, which meant that the force he could bring to bear had just grown. Not only would his grove and garden benefit from the increased power of nature's bounty, but he suspected that channeling Storm's fury through the Staff of Natural Harmony would result in a more potent effect as well. A grand achievement for one so young and inexperienced, came Nerthus's voice, though when Elijah looked up at the majestic tree at the center of the grove, there was no physical representation of the spirit. Instead, the voice was disembodied, which somehow seemed even more magical. I have chosen my guardian well, it seems. Then, Nerthus's presence faded away before Elijah had a chance to ask any questions. He was about to head back to the cabin when a new notification flashed before his eyes, this one even more interesting than the one that had announced the completion of his staff. Winter had come, blanketing the region around the settlement in a thick layer of snow. The temperatures had plummeted well below freezing, and as a result, food, as well as every other necessary resource, had grown scarce. Alyssa and a few of the other hunters with martial archetypes hunted as much as possible, and other members of the growing community frequently gathered supplies from the remnants of the town. But the pickings were growing slimmer by the day. Already, the local market had been picked clean of non-perishable goods, and the gathering parties had been forced to range further with every passing week. They'd found a few gas stations here and there, as well as a couple of fast food restaurants, but for the most part, they had been forced to gather wild edibles like mushrooms and berries. With winter having descended, even those sources of food had dried up. Alyssa sat next to Carmen's forge, where her wife was busy shaping a hunk of metal into what would probably become a sword. She watched as the other woman's hammer repeatedly fell upon the hot steel. The spear that Alyssa favored, another of Carmen's creations, was never far away. They'd been attacked often enough that she didn't dare walk around unarmed. Not anymore. Finally, Carmen was satisfied with the shape, so she shoved it into the forge, which was really just a fire pit, and let out a sigh. Then she turned to Alyssa and asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Alyssa said. She sat in a camp chair she'd retrieved from the house when she and a few others had returned to gather any supplies they'd left behind. Most of the house had been ripped to pieces by some unknown monster, but the chair, along with a few other essentials, had survived. Not buying it," Carmen said. "Come on. Lay it on me. Why does something have to be wrong? Can't I just want to watch my wife work?" she asked. Again, not buying it. You never stop moving unless something's gone wrong. So, what's going on? Carmen asked. Alyssa sighed. Same as always. Not enough food, she said. Not enough wood. Not enough of anything really. We have almost 300 people living here now, and unless something changes, there's no way we can survive the winter. That, Alyssa agreed. Carmen wiped the sweat from her brow, then grabbed a huge stump she often used as a chair. It had to weigh at least 300 pounds, but with her enhanced strength, she didn't even struggle with it. Carmen had always been a strong woman, but she'd begun to approach superhuman levels. Of course, that had come at the cost of her other attributes, none of which had seen any significant investment. Despite Alyssa's words of caution, Carmen had no interest in increasing her dexterity, constitution, or the more ephemeral Ethera attributes. We're going to have to go on another supply run soon, Alyssa said. I was talking to Roman about it, and he thinks we should go tomorrow. Miggy won't like that, Carmen said. And you? I don't like it either, she admitted. But I'm an adult and I know what's going on here. Either you do what needs to be done, or none of us survive. Someone else could go. Carmen shook her head, then put her hand on Alyssa's thigh. You're the highest level here, she said. Face it, you're the most important person in this whole community. Roman is an asshole who nobody likes, Carmen stated. He tries. He works as hard as anybody. Harder, even. But think about it, Alyssa. Everyone sees you out there on the front lines, leading the charge. Meanwhile, Roman's in the back with all the non-combatants, firing away from relative safety. On top of that, he's the guy who's telling everyone they can only have so much food. That they have to work or get kicked out. This place would collapse without him. I know that. You know that. And deep down, most other people do too. But just because they recognize that he's essential doesn't mean they like the guy. Hell, he's saved my life twice now, and I still barely tolerate him, Carmen said. The fact that most people didn't particularly care for Roman wasn't news to Alyssa, though she certainly didn't think it was fair. Without his influence, the small community would have long since failed. People would have starved if he hadn't instituted rationing or insisted that everyone had to contribute in some way. Whether it was gathering or hunting, no one was exempt from food procurement duties. He's a good man. Again, not arguing that he isn't, Carmen said, holding up her hands in surrender. I'm just saying he's an asshole. And nobody likes assholes. Alyssa shook her head, then leaned over, her head in her hands as she massaged her temples. She certainly hadn't signed up to lead a community, and she didn't think she was cut out for it. However, because she'd reached level 9, making her the highest level person in the settlement, people looked to her for guidance. As she went, the community would follow. Doesn't matter, she said. I think it matters more than you want to admit, but okay, Carmen said. So, how far do you think you'll have to go? Alyssa shrugged. At least a few miles, she said. Maybe further. Last time he climbed the water tower, Rick said he thought he saw some buildings about 10 miles to the north. So, at worst, we'll have to go there. Any signs it's inhabited? Not by people, Alyssa answered. Not for the first time. She tried to wrap her head around how much the world had been transformed. Before, Easton had been only a few miles from Seattle's city limits, but now, there was nothing but forest for dozens of miles all around, with only pockets of the abandoned remnants of civilization. Alyssa had confirmed it for herself when she'd climbed the water tower at the center of town. It seemed that they'd managed to gather all the local survivors into one place, which was both horrifying and gratifying. Horrifying because it suggested that the mortality rate approached 70 or 80%. On the other hand, the fact that everyone was willing to gather in one spot and work together for the greater good was certainly a good thing. Alyssa had seen enough post-apocalyptic movies where the world was ruled by warlords to be thankful that such a fate hadn't come to pass. Perhaps it was different in more populated areas. Or maybe not. Either way, she couldn't concern herself with hypotheticals that couldn't be proved one way or another. Instead, she needed to focus on her own situation. For a while, she and Carmen sat together, just enjoying one another's company. Miguel was in the main building with the other surviving children. Without the benefit of an archetype, the cutoff seemed to be 15 years old. They weren't yet equipped to make it in the new world. Are you going to be back for Christmas? Carmen asked. I hope so, Alyssa answered, fervently hoping that she could spend the holiday, if such a thing even mattered anymore, with her family. It was 3 days away, as far as they could tell, at least, and she wanted more than anything to be there for what would probably be a very subdued celebration. However, the needs of the many outweighed her desire for family time. She hoped Miguel understood why she just didn't have as much time for him as she would have liked. Eventually, duty called and Alyssa bade her wife goodbye. After that, she stopped by to see Miguel before reporting to the armory. She was the first of the hunters to do so, which gave her a few minutes to look her status over. Alyssa Heart. Level. Archetype. Class. Not applicable. Specialization. Not applicable. Alignment. Not applicable. Strength. Dexterity. Constitution. 7. Regeneration. 7. Movement. Cultivation. Body. Formed. Unlike Carmen, Alyssa had chosen to spread the 16 free attribute points out, allocating a few into each category. She'd brought all of her physical attributes to double digits, but Ethera and regeneration had lagged a little behind. The benefits were apparent, and she felt stronger, more coordinated, and far more durable than she ever had before. She'd never been in bad shape, but with the increased physical capability that came with her new attributes, Alyssa had no trouble throwing a grown man over her shoulder in a fireman's carry. She knew that because she'd been forced to do just that on more than one occasion, and even hindered by the extra weight, she could sprint at speeds appropriate for a professional athlete. And during her frequent hunts, she'd also taken enough wounds to know precisely how much more durable she'd become. Attacks that would have once been debilitating were far less severe, and she healed from them far more quickly than ever before. But even with her increased attributes, the most important change had come from her abilities. Archetype, Warrior. A versatile melee archetype, proficient with most weaponry. Features bonuses to durability, strength, and learning martial techniques. Required aspect. Martial abilities. Heavy blow. Increase the damage of your melee attacks by 5%. Toggled personal augmentation. Dash forward at 200% your normal speed for 3 seconds. Your next attack will do 30% more damage. Stomp the ground, sending a wave of force to stun opponents. Incapacitates lesser enemies. Hardened skin. Increase your constitution by 1 point per level. Current 9. Toggled personal augmentation. Recover. Focus your Ethera, tripling your regeneration. Impale. Strike an enemy, causing damage over time. Or summon a shield of Ethera to protect allies. Weapon mastery. Grants basic competence with any weapon. Champions shout. Strike fear into your enemies' hearts, weakening their resolve. Enrage. Channel Ethera into rage, increasing all physical attributes. All of her abilities were powerful, though a few of them came with significant caveats. For instance, Recover allowed her to heal from grievous injuries in a fraction of the time that would normally be required, but it rapidly drained her Ethera as well. The other abilities were also limited either by Ethera, time, or an ephemeral cap on how many self-buffs she could maintain. At present, she usually had heavy blows active, but she'd found a few occasions where hardened skin was more useful. The only one that didn't seem to count toward her limit was weapon mastery, which seemed to always be active, regardless of the situation. Alyssa was busy considering it when the others arrived. First, there was Tony, one of the town's rangers. Thin and dark-skinned, he was level 6, which made him the 4th highest leveled person in the community behind Alyssa, Carmen, and Roman. "Hey," he said as he came into the room. Following him was Fiona, a mousy woman who'd chosen the sorcerer archetype. Then, finally, Trish came into view. She was one of only 3 healers in the settlement. Alyssa had argued against her inclusion, but Trish had insisted upon coming, citing the very probable need for a healer. Alyssa had reluctantly acknowledged that the blonde woman was right, but she'd have still preferred it if one of the other healers had been available. They all exchanged greetings before Alyssa said, "I guess we need to get going. If we move quickly, we should be able to make it to the Robinson house before nightfall." There wasn't much else to say, so they quickly set out, passing through the building's lobby, then crossing the parking lot and exiting through the gate. Often, Alyssa found herself marveling at how much had changed, and in only a handful of months. Tony ranged ahead, using his abilities to stay hidden as he scouted their route. Periodically, he would return to the road to report his findings while the others moved at a much more sedate pace. Alyssa could have gone much faster, but neither Trish nor Fiona had invested heavily in their physical attributes. Even so, Alyssa knew that if they were attacked, both would prove their worth. Gradually, they covered ground until, as the sun began to set, they reached a large log cabin. The mailbox labeled it as belonging to the Robinsons, though no one knew what had happened to the original owners. What they did know was that the house, with its sturdy walls, made for a great shelter, and it had often been used as such by foragers who needed to spend the night away from the settlement. Though it was technically labeled as a log cabin, the house was more of a mansion than anything else. The sort of place the incredibly wealthy built, and when they stayed there, they called it roughing it. So, to make it safe, Alyssa and the others had been forced to board the windows and block most of the doors. That had been months back, and the house had proved its worth on more than one occasion. So, as the group settled in for the night, they had every reason to feel secure. They weren't. A little after midnight, something huge and scaly burst through the door, tearing it free of its hinges. Alyssa, who was the one who happened to be on watch at the time, sprang into action, using Champion's Shout. At the sound of Alyssa's raised voice, the creature stumbled a bit, but it was otherwise unaffected. Shocked, Alyssa raised her spear and sprang forward, engaging the massive creature so the others would have a chance to respond. Alyssa leaped toward the monster before she even took the time to properly analyze it. Using Impale, she thrust her spear forward, but to her horror, the creature's heavy scales turned the blade aside. Off balance, she couldn't arrest her momentum quickly enough to keep herself from ramming into it, shoulder first. It took the blow, skidding backward only a few scant inches. She stomped on its talon-like foot, using shockwave at the same time. Disoriented, the monster lashed out with a backhanded blow that took Alyssa in the chest. She felt her ribs break before she flew backward, only slowing when she hit one of the room's couches. It flipped, and she tumbled to a stop a few feet later. Owing to her enhanced constitution, Alyssa maintained consciousness, albeit barely. However, pain lanced through her chest with every breath, and after only a couple of ragged gasps, she coughed up blood. Knowing she didn't have much of a choice, she used Recover. In addition to rapidly draining her Ethera, the ability was only usable once every couple of days, so she usually kept it in reserve for emergencies. But with what felt like a punctured lung, she thought the current situation counted as just that. Instantly, she felt better, though it would still take some time for the increased regeneration to heal the damage. But it was enough to mend the punctured lung in short order, which was all that really mattered to get her back on her feet. Using her spear as a lever, she pushed herself upright in time to see a fireball hit the monster in the face. That brief bit of illumination showed her a creature that resembled nothing she'd ever seen before. With blue-green scales, plated ridges above its eyes, and a squashed visage, the thing was wholly unique. More, it was a little shorter than her, though from the muscles rippling beneath its scales, it wasn't difficult to see how it had managed to knock her across the room with a single blow. The fireball sent it stumbling backward, and Alyssa saw a blurry shadow materialize behind the monster. A second later, Tony appeared, stabbing his sword into the monster's back. Hissing loudly, it wheeled around much more quickly than any of them could have anticipated. Tony tried to retreat, but he was far too slow. The monster's claw shot out, easily tearing through Tony's thin, leather armor. It didn't stop there. In fact, it didn't even slow when it hit flesh, and an instant later, the claw burst through Tony's back. Blood splattered against the broken door, and the shocked ranger desperately tried to wrench himself free. But it was a futile effort. The monster pulled him close. Another fireball hit it in the back, but it paid no heed. Instead, it cocked its head to the side as it listened to Tony's increasingly desperate screams. Then, to Alyssa's horror, its tongue snaked out, running along Tony's face. Then, it tilted its head back and let out a hissing laugh. Alyssa marshaled her courage and shouted, "Run! I'll hold it!" Dashing forward on wobbly legs, she tried to bound over the couch, but she stumbled. She caught herself, But by that point, it was too late. The damage had been done. Alyssa's shout had gotten the creature's attention, and it responded by tossing Tony aside. He crumpled to the ground in a boneless heap. Alyssa barely saw it. Instead, she struggled to get her boar spear set. And to her eternal surprise, she managed to jam her foot down on the butt of the spear just in time. The stunned monster bounded forward, impaling itself with its own momentum. The blade bit deep before the shaft snapped. And then it was on her. In a panic, Alyssa used hardened skin, replacing heavy blows just before its claws reached her. She fell back, shielding her face with her forearms. The creature's claws shredded her leather armor like it wasn't even there. Then, it got to her flesh, which fared no better. Despite her enhanced constitution, the monster's talons ripped through her with ease, sending great gouts of blood to coat the walls. Alyssa went into shock, but she kept her wits about her enough to pull her machete from the sheath at her waist. With the monster's claws digging into her chest, she went to work. Screaming, she activated in rage, flooding her body with her furious rage. The ability to think rationally fled before the onslaught of emotion. The blade fell, dislodging one of the rigid scales above the monster's slitted eye. It howled in pain, trying to retract its claw, but Alyssa grabbed hold of its wrist and swung again. And again. When she pulled the blade back, it was coated in blood. She swung again and was rewarded with a wet thunk. At some point, her own screams joined the monster's cries. Vaguely, Alyssa recognized another fireball splashing against the creature's back, but she couldn't be bothered to care. Her mind was swimming in a sea of fury, and the only thing keeping her conscious was the next swing. And the next after that. Over and over, Alyssa swung that machete. Each attack bit a little deeper until its screams became whimpers. Then, rage ran its course. It only lasted a few short moments. 20 seconds at most. Normally, that was enough to win any battle. But this was no normal creature, and though she'd wounded the monster, she hadn't put it down. Her shoulders sagged, and her next attack was like swinging through water. The results were predictable. Alyssa's machete hit the creature's wounded head, but robbed of any momentum, it did almost nothing. The scaled monster recognized the difference, and it reacted with alacrity, slinging Alyssa across the room, where she collided with one of the pillars holding the roof upright. It splintered. Someone screamed. Another fireball smashed into the monster, catching it off guard. It stumbled. And Tony, who'd somehow clung to life and crawled into position, latched onto the monster's ankle and shouted, "Run." It came out in a croak that Alyssa, in her dazed, wounded, and drained state, barely understood. Another fireball hit the monster, preventing it from rising. The flames splashed onto the floor, catching the rug on fire. That was when Alyssa's struggling mind put things together. The glow she'd barely noticed wasn't from Fiona's fireballs. Not directly. Rather, the entire cabin had caught fire, and it was on the verge of becoming a raging inferno. Someone grabbed Alyssa by the armpits, and suddenly, she was being dragged across the floor. Slowly. So slowly, she muttered, "Save yourself." But Trish wasn't going to do that. She couldn't move Alyssa either. Not with enough speed. She needed a different strategy. Fortunately, she was a healer. Often, Trish forgot that fact, largely because using her lone spell came with a significant cooldown. If she used Mend, she would be useless afterwards. So, like Alyssa's strategy concerning Recover, she saved it for emergencies. However, unlike Alyssa, she was terrible at determining when there was no other choice, so she often waited too long, or simply forgot to use it entirely. Some of that was mitigated by her husband's influence. So long as Roman, or someone else with a decent head for battle, was around, Trish was an extremely valuable asset. Still, even Trish was capable of seeing that, if she was going to save Alyssa, she had little choice but to use her spell. So, that was what she did. Vitality rushed into Alyssa, mending her broken bones, ruptured organs, and rent flesh. In less than a second, Alyssa was in perfect condition. She shouted, "Fiona, target the pillars." One look was all she needed to determine that the ranger had died. He'd used the last of his energy to give them a chance, and Alyssa wasn't going to waste it. So, she grabbed Trish's arm and yelled, "Evacuate!" Alyssa, Fiona, and Trish ran, making for the back door. Along the way, Fiona continued to use her spell to set the interior of the cabin on fire. And then, suddenly, they were free. Stumbling in the snow, the trio went down in a heap, and a second later, the roof collapsed in a giant conflagration of burning wood. Alyssa rolled over and pushed herself to her feet. If the monster could survive that, then they'd never had any chance to kill it. Still, she watched for a long few minutes as the building steadily succumbed to the fire. What the hell was that thing? Fiona asked at last. Despite the battle, the small woman had escaped almost completely unscathed. But that wasn't a surprise. She had an ability that protected her from fire, and she'd never been in the thick of the fight. Trish was a little worse off, but she'd escaped largely unharmed. I don't know, Alyssa said. I've never seen anything like it. It felt wrong. Huh? Asked Alyssa, turning to Trish. The other woman had turned away, clearly struggling with what had happened. Alyssa reached out to comfort her, but Trish pulled away, retreating a couple of steps. You didn't feel it? Even just thinking about it makes me want to throw up, she said, gesturing toward the flames. I felt it, Fiona said. Alyssa shook her head. I don't know. I guess I just wasn't in any state to notice, she stated, watching the fire burn. As she did, she drew her backup weapon, the long dagger she kept strapped to her thigh. After all, even if the creature was dead, she hadn't felt an influx of experience. The monster hadn't died. No sooner had that thought crossed her mind than a flaming figure burst free of the burning building. Its scales were half melted, and it screeched in obvious pain. But it wasn't dead. Not yet. It raced across the snow-covered ground. Alyssa reacted, trying to intercept it. Fiona shouted. And Trish froze. The monster hit her with the force of a runaway car, ripping through her comparatively soft body with ease. If Alyssa had ever wondered about the effects of her inflated constitution, she only needed to remember how Trish was practically torn apart. Alyssa had endured a similar attack, and though it was enough to have killed her without the healer's intervention, she had more or less remained intact. Trish couldn't make that claim. In fact, she couldn't do anything as her body ragdolled across the terrain, leaving a wide smear of blood behind. Alyssa shouted, then leaped upon the monster's back. Flames licked at her, but she didn't care. Her fury wasn't as all-encompassing as it had been under the effects of enrage, but it wasn't far off either. Her dagger rose, then fell. Over and over as she dug through monster's weakened scales. It tried to dislodge her. It flailed, screeching and screaming. But Alyssa wouldn't be denied. And eventually, her blade bit into its brain. Still, it took 3 more blows before it finally went limp, falling to the melting snow. Alyssa kept going until, at last, Fiona grabbed her by the arms and dragged her away. By that point, she had taken a few burns, but she wasn't concerned with that. Instead, she only cared about making the monster pay. So, when, at last, it perished, all the fight went out of her. Vaguely, she was aware of some notifications splashing across her inner eye, but she ignored them as she looked at Trish's limp body. The woman was dead, practically ripped in two. "Oh God," she muttered. "Oh my God." Fiona didn't respond because there was nothing else for either of them to say. Elijah wasn't sure what it meant. Certainly, on the most basic level, the list floating before his inner eye was easily understood. There was no mistaking that much. But the implications were far more difficult to figure out. Still, he studied it, starting with a simple message. 5 months have passed since the world tree reached this world, giving inhabitants enough time to establish themselves. These are the future leaders of your planet. Had it really been 5 months? It didn't seem like it. But then again, even before the onset of winter, the days had begun to blend together. So, the passage of so much time didn't come as too jarring of a surprise. Even so, it did give him hope that soon enough, winter would release the area from its cold grip. When it did, he could hopefully progress past mere survival and to something more fulfilling. Perhaps he could even figure out a way to cross the strait. In any case, Elijah moved on to the second notification, which was a list. Planetary Power Rankings, Earth. 1. Oscar Ramirez, level 26. 2. Sadie Song, level 25. 3. Lisa Song, level 24. 4. Hu Shui, level 24. 5. Ram Khandu, level 21. 6. Anupriya Pandey, level 19. 7. Kimberly Jackson, level 18. 8. Michael King, level 18. 9. Gunnar Lindstrom, level 17. 10. Teresa DuPont, level 16. 11. 12. 13. 99. Caleb Jameson, level 11. 100. Franklin Rich, level 11. Elijah's eyes swept over the list, but unsurprisingly he found that he didn't recognize any of the names. But if it represented the top 100 people in the world, at least regarding levels, that wasn't unexpected. Still, Elijah was a little disappointed that his name wasn't on the list. Of course, that wasn't a surprise either. Not really. It wasn't difficult to imagine the benefits of many people working together or using modern weapons, assuming those still worked. By contrast, Elijah was stranded on an island all alone, and he was preoccupied with mundane concerns like staying warm, finding water, or gathering enough food. It was only recently that he'd managed to branch out into woodworking, and even that was more to pass the time when the weather didn't cooperate. So, discovering that he wasn't at the peak of humanity shouldn't have annoyed him. But it still did for some reason. And it only took him a few minutes to figure out why. First, he'd internalized the idea that he would be Nerthus's protector. Part of that was clearly rooted in the connection he felt to nature, and subsequently, to the tree spirit, but it was also because Nerthus had helped him quite a bit, answering his questions and guiding his cultivation. So, if Elijah could repay the tree spirit by becoming its guardian, then he would. In addition, Elijah suspected that, as the tree spirit matured, and his grove right alongside it, he would be exposed to some benefits that might make him stronger. Or, at the very least, make the island much safer. If Elijah had encountered the Vox, then surely the rest of humanity had as well. And that wasn't even considering things like that giant flying creature that had downed the plane. No, it was a dangerous world out there, and having a safe home was incredibly important. Finally, Elijah found the idea of quantifiable improvement to be somewhat habit-forming. That feeling he'd gotten as he improved his body cultivation, as he'd gained attribute points either via leveling or through rigorous exercise, or as he'd set the foundations for his soul's cultivation, it was all addictive in a way he couldn't really explain. And he wanted more. More levels. More spells. Better cultivation. And seeing that so many people had already exceeded his accomplishments was a little frustrating. But it was also inevitable. Elijah was honest enough with himself to know that he had never been what anyone would categorize as the peak of humanity. He was smart and athletic, but he was never the smartest or most physically gifted. But could he change that? Perhaps. Either way, Elijah felt compelled to chase the people on that list, which somehow seemed like it might have been the point. He had no idea what the purpose of the system was, but it didn't take a genius to figure out that it wanted them to grow stronger. Elijah studied the list for quite some time before, finally, dismissing the notification. When he did, he found that he could recall it with only a thought, much like he could with his status or his spell book. As he gave the rankings some thought, he circled his grove, flaring nature's bounty along the way. The saplings were on the cusp of reaching maturity, and Elijah found himself keenly looking forward to the completion of his ancestral circle. Once that was done, he would be free to explore the island a little more. As it was, he was limited to how far he could go because he had to leave enough time to get back to the cabin. But if he could teleport, that would change everything. Once he completed 2 revolutions, Elijah headed back to the cabin. Once there, he made some crab and mushroom stew before settling down for the night. He had a blanket of rabbit furs that he'd stitched together with his natural cordage, so for the first time that day, he felt warm. As he lay there, he recalled the rankings a few times, but nothing had changed. So, he summoned his status to see his own progress. Elijah Hart, level 7. Archetype, Druid, class, not applicable. Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, 10. Dexterity, 10. Constitution, 11. 11. Regeneration, 12. Movement, nature, cultivation, body, formed, neophyte. He'd finally managed to reach his original goal of getting each of his attributes to double digits, but nothing else had changed. The fact that Constitution hadn't naturally gained any additional points seemed to support the idea that progressing past 10 in any category required the investment of the free attribute points that came with leveling. Or perhaps the consumption of natural treasures would help with that. Given that he spent a few hours of each day next to one of those natural treasures suggested that the benefits were more esoteric than a few attribute points, though. Maybe that was how people advanced their cultivation. Or maybe those natural treasures could be turned into powerful items like his Staff of Natural Harmony. The possibilities were endless, and without more information, Elijah had no way of knowing the truth of the matter. In fact, his ignorance had become one of his biggest weaknesses, though one without much in the way of solutions. He could only keep plugging along as he tried to survive at least until spring. Once the seasons turned, he could re-evaluate his position. So, he fell asleep, secure in the mandate to simply keep doing what he was doing. Hopefully, things could change as the temperatures rose. The next morning, Elijah awoke to an intense blizzard that had already left the forest coated in ice and covered in a layer of deep snow. But he knew it wouldn't end soon, judging by the storm's fury. Thankfully, the cabin was well placed, so his home was protected from the harsh winds and driving snow. Even so, it made everything more difficult. Even getting water became a chore, and not for the first time, Elijah found himself grateful for the combination of his body cultivation and enhanced constitution. Without it, he would no doubt have frozen, if for no other reason than because he didn't have proper clothing. The shirt he'd been wearing when he'd washed ashore had slowly been repurposed for various tasks, and his pants had been ripped and torn by the crabs. Where his shoes had gone, he had no idea, but he'd been barefoot from the very beginning. That outfit, or lack thereof, would have been fine for a tropical island, but in the middle of a Pacific Northwest winter, it should have been a death sentence. Fortunately, his advancements had taken the bite out of the frigid temperatures, and any other issues that might have cropped up could be removed by touch of nature. Still, being stranded in the middle of a blizzard wearing nothing but a pair of pants was anything but pleasant, even if it was no longer deadly. The next couple of weeks were more of the same, with Elijah being more or less confined to the cabin. He still had to trudge through the snow to get water, and he kept up his efforts with the grove. Otherwise, he remained secluded in the relative warmth of the cabin, covered in his makeshift rabbit fur blanket as he maintained one with nature and periodically pulsed touch of nature to stave off frostbite. Over that time, Elijah lost any excess fat, giving his already compact frame a lean, stringy appearance. His sandy blonde curls continued to lengthen into a wild nest of hair, and his beard grew into something a lumberjack would be proud of. Meanwhile, to distract himself, Elijah explored his cultivation. First, he spent quite some time trying to familiarize himself with the new shape of his soul, which felt far more amorphous than the pathways had been. Because of that, the flow of Ethera was less constrained, which resulted in the gains he'd already seen. But beyond that, he was incapable of discovering a way to continue his advancement. The same could be said for his body, which was even less responsive than his soul, leading him to the conclusion that he was missing something vitally important. But secluded as he was, without even Nerthus to guide him, Elijah had no idea how to progress. Thankfully, his mind was a different story altogether, and after weeks of poking and prodding, he latched onto something that felt important. In a lot of ways, it was an intuitive leap. But in others, it made so much sense that Elijah found himself wondering why it had taken him so long. Of course, the crux of the matter was that, like all the other facets of cultivation, it was incredibly uncomfortable, which meant that it wasn't something a person could just stumble upon. Instead, it required focused effort, which, once Elijah decided to pursue it, was one of the few things he had in abundant supply. The technique, if it could even be called such a thing, was simple in that it only required him to flex his mind to such a point that the flow of ambient Ethera increased. In principle, easy. In practice, it was far from it, and on more than a few days, it resulted in a crippling headache. But Elijah felt like he made progress all the same. He might not have been capable of reaching the levels of the people he saw on the rankings list, but he found himself driven by the hope that his cultivation might be even more valuable than a few extra levels. Besides, as uncomfortable, and often painful, as it was, it at least gave Elijah an opportunity for improvement, which with the weather the way it was was in short supply. Then one day, the weather began to change. At first, Elijah thought it was just a warm front coming through the area, but after a few more weeks of steadily warmer temperatures, he reasoned that winter had finally released the region from its grip. It still wasn't comfortable, but at least the frost melted, and the animals began to stir. So it happened that a little over 2 months after the rankings had been released, spring managed to shoulder winter completely aside. And with that came the moment for which Elijah had been working for months, the completion of the grove, heralded by a notification from the system. Congratulations! Your grove has reached maturity. Teleportation function of Ancestral Circle will be available after forging the bond with the grove. Elijah pumped his fist in celebration, grinning broadly as he threw the blanket aside. Thankfully, it was already morning, so he didn't have to wait before heading toward the grove to check things out. So, he gathered his hand-woven satchel and his staff before leaving the cabin behind. The air still had a chill to it, and some of the snow remained unmelted. However, most of the ground was clear. As a result, he made good time as he traversed the forest, making his way to the grove. To his surprise, the saplings, or trees, now looked to have grown 10 feet overnight. That took him by surprise, but in a world of magic, his shock didn't last long. The trees themselves were still dwarfed by Nerthus, though they were clearly from the same species. One day, perhaps they would attain sentience as well. Or maybe not, considering that, regardless of how they looked, Nerthus felt different than the other trees. Either way, Elijah was more than a little excited to bond with his newly finished grove. Once he'd made his way to the center of the meadow, he settled down under Nerthus's broad limbs before dragging Ethera from his core and pushing it into Ancestral Grove. Synergy found. Do you wish to bind yourself to the Grove of Nerthus? Even though Elijah was a little wary of the grove's name, Nerthus had been nothing but helpful. And besides, it wasn't like he had the desire or opportunity to grow another grove. In his exploration of the island, he hadn't discovered enough free space to plant a circle of trees, and besides, he'd been working on the grove for months, saturating it with his magic at every step of the way. Regardless of the name, it was as much his as it was Nerthus's glade. So, Elijah consented to the binding. A moment later, a presence erupted in his mind, sending him reeling until he collapsed to his knees. Perhaps Elijah wasn't sure what it meant. Certainly, on the most basic level, the list floating before his inner eye was easily understood. There was no mistaking that much. But the implications were far more difficult to figure out. Still, he studied it, starting with a simple message. 5 months have passed since the world tree reached this world, giving inhabitants enough time to establish themselves. These are the future leaders of your planet. Had it really been 5 months? It didn't seem like it. But then again, even before the onset of winter, the days had begun to blend together. So, the passage of so much time didn't come as too jarring of a surprise. Even so, it did give him hope that soon enough, winter would release the area from its cold grip. When it did, he could hopefully progress past mere survival and to something more fulfilling. Perhaps he could even figure out a way to cross the strait. In any case, Elijah moved on to the second notification, which was a list. Planetary Power Rankings, Earth. 1. Oscar Ramirez, level 26. 2. Sadie Song, level 25. 3. Lisa Song, level 24. 4. Hu Shui, level 24. 5. Ram Kandu, level 21. 6. Anupriya Pandey, level 19. 7. Kimberly Jackson, level 18. 8. Michael King, level 18. 9. Gunnar Lindstrom, level 17. 10. Teresa DuPont, level 16. 11. 12. 13. 99. Caleb Jameson, level 11. 100. Franklin Rich, level 11. Elijah's eyes swept over the list, but unsurprisingly he found that he didn't recognize any of the names. But if it represented the top 100 people in the world, at least regarding levels, that wasn't unexpected. Still, Elijah was a little disappointed that his name wasn't on the list. Of course, that wasn't a surprise either. Not really. It wasn't difficult to imagine the benefits of many people working together or using modern weapons, assuming those still worked. By contrast, Elijah was stranded on an island all alone, and he was preoccupied with mundane concerns like staying warm, finding water, or gathering enough food. It was only recently that he'd managed to branch out into woodworking, and even that was more to pass the time when the weather didn't cooperate. So, discovering that he wasn't at the peak of humanity shouldn't have annoyed him. But it still did for some reason. And it only took him a few minutes to figure out why. First, he'd internalized the idea that he would be Nerthus's protector. Part of that was clearly rooted in the connection he felt to nature, and subsequently, to the tree spirit, but it was also because Nerthus had helped him quite a bit, answering his questions and guiding his cultivation. So, if Elijah could repay the tree spirit by becoming its guardian, then he would. In addition, Elijah suspected that, as the tree spirit matured, and his grove right alongside it, he would be exposed to some benefits that might make him stronger. Or, at the very least, make the island much safer. If Elijah had encountered the Vox, then surely the rest of humanity had as well. And that wasn't even considering things like that giant flying creature that had downed the plane. No, it was a dangerous world out there, and having a safe home was incredibly important. Finally, Elijah found the idea of quantifiable improvement to be somewhat habit-forming. That feeling he'd gotten as he improved his body cultivation, as he'd gained attribute points either via leveling or through rigorous exercise, or as he'd set the foundations for his soul's cultivation, it was all addictive in a way he couldn't really explain. And he wanted more. More levels. More spells. Better cultivation. And seeing that so many people had already exceeded his accomplishments was a little frustrating. But it was also inevitable. Elijah was honest enough with himself to know that he had never been what anyone would categorize as the peak of humanity. He was smart and athletic, but he was never the smartest or most physically gifted. But could he change that? Perhaps. Either way, Elijah felt compelled to chase the people on that list, which somehow seemed like it might have been the point. He had no idea what the purpose of the system was, but it didn't take a genius to figure out that it wanted them to grow stronger. Elijah studied the list for quite some time before, finally, dismissing the notification. When he did, he found that he could recall it with only a thought, much like he could with his status or his spell book. As he gave the rankings some thought, he circled his grove, flaring nature's bounty along the way. The saplings were on the cusp of reaching maturity, and Elijah found himself keenly looking forward to the completion of his ancestral circle. Once that was done, he would be free to explore the island a little more. As it was, he was limited to how far he could go because he had to leave enough time to get back to the cabin. But if he could teleport, that would change everything. Once he completed 2 revolutions, Elijah headed back to the cabin. Once there, he made some crab and mushroom stew before settling down for the night. He had a blanket of rabbit furs that he'd stitched together with his natural cordage, so for the first time that day, he felt warm. As he lay there, he recalled the rankings a few times, but nothing had changed. So, he summoned his status to see his own progress. Elijah Hart, level 7. Archetype, Druid, class, not applicable. Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, 10. Dexterity, 10. Constitution, 11. 11. Regeneration, 12. Movement, nature, cultivation, body, formed, neophyte. He'd finally managed to reach his original goal of getting each of his attributes to double digits, but nothing else had changed. The fact that Constitution hadn't naturally gained any additional points seemed to support the idea that progressing past 10 in any category required the investment of the free attribute points that came with leveling. Or perhaps the consumption of natural treasures would help with that. Given that he spent a few hours of each day next to one of those natural treasures suggested that the benefits were more esoteric than a few attribute points, though. Maybe that was how people advanced their cultivation. Or maybe those natural treasures could be turned into powerful items like his Staff of Natural Harmony. The possibilities were endless, and without more information, Elijah had no way of knowing the truth of the matter. In fact, his ignorance had become one of his biggest weaknesses, though one without much in the way of solutions. He could only keep plugging along as he tried to survive at least until spring. Once the seasons turned, he could re-evaluate his position. So, he fell asleep, secure in the mandate to simply keep doing what he was doing. Hopefully, things could change as the temperatures rose. The next morning, Elijah awoke to an intense blizzard that had already left the forest coated in ice and covered in a layer of deep snow. But he knew it wouldn't end soon, judging by the storm's fury. Thankfully, the cabin was well placed, so his home was protected from the harsh winds and driving snow. Even so, it made everything more difficult. Even getting water became a chore, and not for the first time, Elijah found himself grateful for the combination of his body cultivation and enhanced constitution. Without it, he would no doubt have frozen, if for no other reason than because he didn't have proper clothing. The shirt he'd been wearing when he'd washed ashore had slowly been repurposed for various tasks, and his pants had been ripped and torn by the crabs. Where his shoes had gone, he had no idea, but he'd been barefoot from the very beginning. That outfit, or lack thereof, would have been fine for a tropical island, but in the middle of a Pacific Northwest winter, it should have been a death sentence. Fortunately, his advancements had taken the bite out of the frigid temperatures, and any other issues that might have cropped up could be removed by touch of nature. Still, being stranded in the middle of a blizzard wearing nothing but a pair of pants was anything but pleasant, even if it was no longer deadly. The next couple of weeks were more of the same, with Elijah being more or less confined to the cabin. He still had to trudge through the snow to get water, and he kept up his efforts with the grove. Otherwise, he remained secluded in the relative warmth of the cabin, covered in his makeshift rabbit fur blanket as he maintained one with nature and periodically pulsed touch of nature to stave off frostbite. Over that time, Elijah lost any excess fat, giving his already compact frame a lean, stringy appearance. His sandy blonde curls continued to lengthen into a wild nest of hair, and his beard grew into something a lumberjack would be proud of. Meanwhile, to distract himself, Elijah explored his cultivation. First, he spent quite some time trying to familiarize himself with the new shape of his soul, which felt far more amorphous than the pathways had been. Because of that, the flow of Ethera was less constrained, which resulted in the gains he'd already seen. But beyond that, he was incapable of discovering a way to continue his advancement. The same could be said for his body, which was even less responsive than his soul, leading him to the conclusion that he was missing something vitally important. But secluded as he was, without even Nerthus to guide him, Elijah had no idea how to progress. Thankfully, his mind was a different story altogether, and after weeks of poking and prodding, he latched onto something that felt important. In a lot of ways, it was an intuitive leap. But in others, it made so much sense that Elijah found himself wondering why it had taken him so long. Of course, the crux of the matter was that, like all the other facets of cultivation, it was incredibly uncomfortable, which meant that it wasn't something a person could just stumble upon. Instead, it required focused effort, which, once Elijah decided to pursue it, was one of the few things he had in abundant supply. The technique, if it could even be called such a thing, was simple in that it only required him to flex his mind to such a point that the flow of ambient Ethera increased. In principle, easy. In practice, it was far from it, and on more than a few days, it resulted in a crippling headache. But Elijah felt like he made progress all the same. He might not have been capable of reaching the levels of the people he saw on the rankings list, but he found himself driven by the hope that his cultivation might be even more valuable than a few extra levels. Besides, as uncomfortable, and often painful, as it was, it at least gave Elijah an opportunity for improvement, which with the weather the way it was in short supply. Then one day, the weather began to change. At first, Elijah thought it was just a warm front coming through the area, but after a few more weeks of steadily warmer temperatures, he reasoned that winter had finally released the region from its grip. It still wasn't comfortable, but at least the frost melted, and the animals began to stir. So it happened that a little over 2 months after the rankings had been released, spring managed to shoulder winter completely aside. And with that came the moment for which Elijah had been working for months, the completion of the grove, heralded by a notification from the system. Congratulations! Your grove has reached maturity. Teleportation function of Ancestral Circle will be available after forging the bond with the grove. Elijah pumped his fist in celebration, grinning broadly as he threw the blanket aside. Thankfully, it was already morning, so he didn't have to wait before heading toward the grove to check things out. So, he gathered his hand-woven satchel and his staff before leaving the cabin behind. The air still had a chill to it, and some of the snow remained unmelted. However, most of the ground was clear. As a result, he made good time as he traversed the forest, making his way to the grove. To his surprise, the saplings, or trees, now looked to have grown 10 feet overnight. That took him by surprise, but in a world of magic, his shock didn't last long. The trees themselves were still dwarfed by Nerthus, though they were clearly from the same species. One day, perhaps they would attain sentience as well. Or maybe not, considering that, regardless of how they looked, Nerthus felt different than the other trees. Either way, Elijah was more than a little excited to bond with his newly finished grove. Once he'd made his way to the center of the meadow, he settled down under Nerthus's broad limbs before dragging Ethera from his core and pushing it into Ancestral Grove. Synergy found. Do you wish to bind yourself to the Grove of Nerthus? Even though Elijah was a little wary of the grove's name, Nerthus had been nothing but helpful. And besides, it wasn't like he had the desire or opportunity to grow another grove. In his exploration of the island, he hadn't discovered enough free space to plant a circle of trees, and besides, he'd been working on the grove for months, saturating it with his magic at every step of the way. Regardless of the name, it was as much his as it was Nerthus's glade. So, Elijah consented to the binding. A moment later, a presence erupted in his mind, sending him reeling until he collapsed to his knees. Perhaps he should have been more careful after all. It was like a bomb going off in Elijah's head. If he'd thought using one with nature was a little overwhelming, then the deluge of sensory input that came when he'd completed the grove nearly crushed his mind into pulp. He could feel everything, right down to the smallest insect, screaming inside his head. But more than that, he knew things he had no business knowing. Like the existence of 42 squirrels within 100 yards of the grove. Or exactly how many trees comprised the forest in that same area. Or how many leaves were on the ground. If he concentrated, he could even say precisely how many grains of dirt were within his range. And given that he could sense everything within 100 yards of the outside edge of his grove, that was a lot of dirt. That sudden awareness washed over him, and for a long time he was rendered insensate. Drool fell from the corner of his mouth as he lay there, staring up at the sky but seeing nothing. Elijah very nearly lost himself to it. Even as day wore into night, and the night into the next day, Elijah didn't move a muscle. Then, suddenly, he began to acclimate. The adaptation took another day, during which he gradually filtered the awareness down to a minimum. It was still there, hovering at the edge of his consciousness and threatening to overwhelm him. However, he kept it at bay via sheer concentration. It wasn't pleasant, but he could do it. Probably. So long as he didn't lose his grip. Which didn't seem all that likely. But he'd survived it once, and he could do it again, even if that definitely wasn't his goal. But what if he increased his mind's cultivation? Would that ease the burden? Or was that completely unrelated? He'd long since decided that the term didn't really refer to his mental capacity. Instead, it seemed wholly focused on his ability to draw Ethera into his soul. But it couldn't hurt, could it? So, sitting there, Elijah went back to his homemade mind cultivation technique. When he first pulled against the ambient Ethera, he nearly lost control and let the awareness blanket his consciousness once again. However, he barely managed to maintain the partition he'd created to hold it in place. Still, it made things that much more difficult because he had to split his attention into two directions. Gradually, he funneled more and more Ethera through his mind and into his soul. It had nowhere to go, so it slowly seeped from his pores and dissipated back into the air, but Elijah kept going. In some ways, it felt like lifting weights with his mind. Each pull was like a bench press repetition, though with the added difficulty that came with maintaining the partition, it was probably more like doing so with one hand while drawing a portrait with another. Or something like that. In any case, Elijah didn't have the mental capacity for metaphors. Instead, he focused his entire brain on the task at hand. And slowly, the depth of his pulls began to increase. Bit by bit, his capacity for input grew. However, as he worked, Elijah noticed an issue. The more Ethera he absorbed through his mind, the flimsier the partition became. So, he had to spend almost as much concentration keeping it in place as he spent increasing his capacity. It was as if, for every step forward, he took 2 steps back. So, after a while, he started shifting some of the Ethera into the partition. It seemed counterintuitive, and Elijah had no real idea what he was doing. Instead, he was just going by instinct. Fortunately, it seemed like that was the last piece of the puzzle, and only an hour later, the Ethera took on a mind of its own. He barely even had to focus, and a river of Ethera flowed into his mind. Wider and wider, the aperture of his mind grew until, at last, something shifted, and the flow stemmed down to a trickle, leaving placidity in its wake. It was only after a few minutes of that piece that he realized he had a new notification. "Congratulations! You have cultivated an opal mind. You did well," came the rough, yet curiously high-pitched voice of the tree spirit, Nerthus. Elijah looked up from where he was sitting to see that the spirit had once again taken on its tiny humanoid form, but this time, it had descended from its customary tree branch to stand beside him. Only then did Elijah realize that it was resting a hand on his shoulder. Unknowable energy flowed from its touch. It felt like the natural Ethera he'd experienced when cultivating his body of wood, but it was far deeper and infinitely more powerful. "What are you doing?" Elijah croaked, his throat raspy with thirst. "How long?" "You have been cultivating for a week," Nerthus replied. "Before that, you were lying here in the grove for 3 days? 10 days? Elijah said. How am I still alive?" "I lent you some of my power," the spirit responded. "After all, you are the protector of my grove. Or you will be. The bond goes both ways." That was news to Elijah. He just wanted to empower his spell so he could teleport around. But now, it seemed that he'd made some kind of pact with a nature spirit of indeterminate power. That didn't seem like it was going to go so well, especially considering the disparity in strength and Elijah's admitted ignorance. "What does that entail?" he asked. "And I thought you said that completing the ancestral circle would bind us together." "I may have stretched the truth. You must consent to the bond, lest I be expelled from your ancestral circle," Nerthus stated, looking down on him with its wooden eyes. Its face was capable of movement, but only just, so the effect was akin to talking to a puppet. "But it benefits you in a number of ways. I will manage the grove, empowering it to levels far beyond what it could reach naturally. And you will guard me against all external threats?" "And this benefits me how?" Elijah asked. Nerthus answered, "Cultivation beyond compare. You will advance faster and more easily than any of your contemporaries. In a year's time, this grove will be home to the densest nature-attuned Ethera on this planet. And that is just the beginning. I will also prevent any intrusions from the Vox. No towers. No portals. You will have a safe place to call home." That certainly sounded good to Elijah, but he felt that his end of the bargain might prove more than a little difficult. After all, he wasn't very strong. Indeed, he wasn't even on the power ladder, so he wasn't sure exactly how well he could protect himself, much less the grove. Likely seeing that Elijah wasn't convinced, Nerthus said, "I will also grow you a home. Yes, in a few months, you will have a home worthy of the Dryads of Drathamar." Elijah had no idea where Drathamar was, but in mythology, Dryads were nature spirits. Perhaps they were just another race of creatures similar to the dwarves, gnomes, and goblins he'd seen across the strait. Still, he wasn't convinced. So he said, "I don't know. This doesn't." "Please," Nerthus pleaded, more emotion than it had thus far shown evident in its voice. "If you do not agree, I will be cast back to my home world. It is terrible there. No chance of advancement at all. That is why I chose to." Its voice petered out, and Elijah expected that it was because the system didn't want Nerthus to say anything else. "I'm not against it, okay?" he said. And it was true. The tree spirit had already helped him quite a bit, giving him as much information as it was allowed to give. And it had just kept him alive while he'd cultivated his opal mind. Couple that with how desperate it seemed, and Elijah really did want to help. He just wasn't sure he could protect himself, much less the tree spirit or its grove. He said as much, adding, "What am I supposed to do if something attacks? If one of those Vox things comes out of the ocean, I'm done for. The only reason I survived last time was because of the panther that lives here. And even that was probably only because I've been feeding it." Nerthus cocked its head, saying, "Do not underestimate yourself. You have unlimited growth potential. You may be weak now, but in a month, you will be stronger. And a year, even more powerful. In a decade, you will have power incomprehensible to your current incarnation. If you survive, it agreed. However, I feel obliged to point out that you have survived this long, have you not? You have strength of heart, conviction, and willpower. Those will take you much further than anything else. Elijah shook his head and looked around. It was a clear night, so the glade was well lit. However, he saw everything with far more acuity than he ever had before. Even in the light of day, his vision was never so sharp. Perhaps that was a result of his mind cultivation. What about this awareness? Elijah asked, his thoughts barely brushing against the partitioned portion of his brain. Even that threatened to overwhelm him. How do I deal with it? Awareness, the tree spirit asked. It is called locus, or presence by some. It is your greatest asset, but it can be overbearing. I can guide you through learning to deal with it, though if you had asked me, I would have suggested that you partition your mind before the grove's completion instead of after. People have died from less. I can believe it, Elijah muttered. Then, he asked, will you be able to give me more information if I agree to be your protector? Nerthus answered, a little. Not much though. The system is very strict with what information is to be made freely available to newly integrated worlds. As time goes by, those restrictions will lift, but it will be years before I could reveal everything I know without dire consequences. Even a little more information would help, because ignorance seemed to be the biggest threat to Elijah's survival. He'd managed to secure food, shelter, and water, the big three as far as he was concerned, so basic necessities were covered. However, he would have died if it wasn't for the tree spirit's intervention, and all because he had no idea what he was doing when it came to the system and cultivation. That alone was probably enough to make the choice for him, but it also came with other benefits, like better cultivation and a home that would presumably improve upon his current situation. And all it would take was for him to play security guard for a magic tree. But wasn't that kind of in the job description for a druid anyway? He sighed, then said, I'll do it. The tree spirit managed to look relieved despite being unable to contort its face into an expression. It said, thank you. You will not regret this. Then, a new notification appeared before Elijah's eyes. Instead of the unadorned boxes he normally saw, this one bore a golden border. It said, do you wish to become the protector of the grove, binding your fate to Nerthus, the ancestral tree spirit? This bond is irrevocable and unbreakable by normal means. Elijah hesitated for only a moment before giving the notification his consent. And then, nothing happened. Thank you, exclaimed Nerthus. You will not regret this. I can already see the home I will grow for you. You will be very pleased. Elijah couldn't help but smile at the excited tree spirit. Still, he asked, is that it? I expected more. The bond is more of a formality that lets me stay on this planet instead of being sent back home. The benefit to you is in the environment, Nerthus said, regaining some of its composure. You should notice an increase in ambient Ethera within a day or two, and I will begin growing your home soon enough. I'm more interested in information for now, Elijah said. This locus sense or whatever, how do I deal with it? It's locked away for now, but you said it was important? Indeed, indeed. It is not meant for the mind of such a low-level druid, Nerthus said. Raising one wooden hand, it continued, but that does not mean you cannot make it work. It merely requires practice. Well, considering I'm stranded on a deserted island, I've got nothing but time, Elijah said. So, let's get to it. Elijah let out a deep breath as he slowly opened the Ethera-bolstered partition in his mind. For the first few seconds, he only let a trickle of sensory input through while forcing the rest to remain sequestered away, but over the next couple of hours he gradually released the rest. And to his surprise, it wasn't nearly as overwhelming as it had been before he'd cultivated his opal mind. At most, it was moderately distracting, though even that was manageable. As far as Elijah could tell, the locus gave him hyper-awareness of everything within 100 yards of his grove. That didn't seem like much until he realized that it constituted over hundreds of thousands of square feet of dense vegetation and copious animal life. But it was more than just knowing things were there. He also felt a connection that hinted at something far deeper than mere awareness. Nerthus had called it an undeveloped domain, but that didn't really mean much to Elijah, save that he expected the connection to grow progressively stronger as he gained power. In addition, the tree spirit had claimed that the area would eventually grow to encompass the entire island. But not until he was far stronger and infinitely more capable of handling such a thing. For now, though, Elijah needed to harness the awareness he did have. Eventually, over the next week, he learned to push all but the most basic information behind the partition. Certainly, if anything went wrong, or if there were intruders, he would feel it. But beyond a simple alarm, the connection was very much diluted, which allowed Elijah to function normally. Even so, that awareness in the back of his mind would definitely take some getting used to. So it happened that he pushed himself to his feet and looked around. He'd been meditating for a few days, during which his basic needs were met by an influx of nature-attuned Ethera. That was one of the side benefits of the grove. It didn't remove the need for sustenance, not entirely, but it did decrease his reliance on food and water. For instance, instead of being able to go without food for a week or two, he felt sure that he could abstain for at least a month, so long as he didn't leave the grove during that time. With water, a week seemed to be his comfortable limit. After that, he suspected he would quickly become dehydrated. Thankfully, Elijah didn't need to push those limits, because, by acclimating himself to the locus, he'd accomplished his most immediate task. As he cast his gaze across the grove, he couldn't help but marvel at the changes. 3 new saplings grew nearby. They were only days old, but already, they had grown to a height of nearly 10 feet. More than that, they didn't extend directly toward the sky. Instead, they twisted in on one another, their thin branches intertwining until Elijah lost track of which one belonged to which tree. According to Nerthus, those 3 trees would grow into his new abode, and the spirit assured him that it would be a grand home indeed. But it would take another month or 2 before it was finished. Until then, Elijah would continue to live in the decrepit old cabin. With that in mind, Elijah trekked back to the stream, gathering mushrooms and berries along the way. Even though there was still a chill in the air, spring had begun to supplant winter, so there was a slightly larger selection than in weeks past. It was still sparse, but that would soon change along with the weather. When he reached the stream, Elijah drank his fill and washed himself in the cold water before heading back to the cabin. The place reeked of rotten crab. No surprise there, Elijah's enforced cultivation hadn't been planned, and as a result, his stores of crab meat had gone bad. Very, very bad, judging by the smell. Even after he gathered the basket and dumped it into the ocean, the smell remained. And he suspected it would for some time. So, with that in mind, he made an executive decision to gather his things and prematurely move to the grove. Fortunately, he didn't have much to gather, just the staff of natural harmony, his various baskets, the rabbit fur blanket, and a few tools. All in all, it only took 1 trip to transfer his belongings to the grove. When he arrived, Nerthus was waiting for him. The tree spirit still spent most of its time in its tree, but now that the ambient Ethera had thickened, it had a little more freedom of movement. "Your home is not ready," it said. "I know," Elijah replied. "But the cabin where I've been living isn't really suitable for habitation anymore. So, with the weather turning, I think I'll be okay here until the house is done. It probably wouldn't be pleasant if it started raining, but it was still better than smelling rotten crab for the next few weeks." On top of that, he was afraid that the smell would attract predators. So, it wasn't just a matter of comfort, but one of safety. "I was wondering," Elijah said. "In my head, I've been using generic pronouns. Like, but it occurs to me that I should ask if you're male, female, or a gender." Nerthus raised a hand of twisted branches, then said, "Your concept of male is the closest to reality. You may think of me in those terms. But. So, I'm going to set my stuff up under your tree, okay? And just remember, this is temporary," he pointed out. "Oh, and is it okay if I build a fire? What with you being wood and all, I didn't want to offend you or anything. My people have been using fire for millions of years," said Nerthus. "No fire you could create on this world could burn the ancestral tree." "Hey, then," Elijah said. With that, Nerthus retreated back inside his tree, merging with it in only a second or two as Elijah set himself up beneath its expansive boughs. The tree's canopy wouldn't provide perfect protection from the elements, but it would be better than nothing. First, he deposited his meager belongings, then he set off back into the forest to gather rocks for a suitable fire pit. As it turned out, the labor was quite a bit easier now that he had the benefit of a properly healthy body. He was sure that the body of wood contributed as well, considering that he was far stronger than he'd ever been before. If he had to gauge it, he expected that his cultivation gave him at least a 50% boost to his physical capability, which put him firmly in the range of peak humanity. Probably even exceeding it, if 10 really was the human limit without the interference of the system, as he suspected. Once he finished the arduous labor involved in toting heavy rocks into the grove, he arranged them in a circle around a pit he'd dug, then went back to his cabin where he gathered the firewood he'd already stockpiled. After that, it wasn't difficult to get the fire started. After all, he had plenty of experience by that point, and settled in for a meal of mushrooms and underripe berries. As he ate, he also took some time to think about his future. With his fate intertwined with the islands and Nerthus, he knew he needed to get stronger. But the problem was that his neighbor, the panther, had already killed everything on the island higher leveled than the crabs. In most ways, he was grateful for his protector, but when it came to getting stronger, it was clear that the panther's presence had stunted his growth. Some familiar names on the ladder had dropped off, either dead or having hit some kind of wall in their leveling, but the ones that had remained continued to get stronger, with the leader, Oscar Ramirez, having reached level 29. And their Elijah was stuck at level 7. He needed to get stronger, and the only way he was likely to reach any of his goals involved exploring the rest of the island. He still didn't even know how big it was, much less whether or not it was home to any viable threats. The panther couldn't be everywhere, after all. Surely, it had left something alive. By the time he'd finished eating, night had already fallen. So, he resolved to begin his exploration of the island when the sun came up, which, the next morning, was exactly what happened. For the next week, Elijah charted the island, and he discovered a few things along the way. First, it was a bit bigger than he'd first suspected. He couldn't be completely sure, but he judged it to be about 6 miles long, running from northwest to southeast and about half as wide. The biome remained consistent, and the area was as densely packed with vegetation as anything Elijah had ever encountered. And thankfully, after about a mile, he started to encounter more wildlife as well. The place was lousy with rabbits, marmots, and moles. He also saw a wide variety of birds, a few lizards that were quite a bit larger than they should have been, and a frog as big as a cocker spaniel. But none of them exuded an aura stronger than the crabs, so he left them alone. That changed when, a few miles away from the grove, Elijah heard a rustle in the bushes. He wheeled around, his staff in one hand and the stone-bladed hatchet he'd been using to cut a path through the vegetation in the other. It was just in time, too, because only a second later, a huge black bear burst through the underbrush. Elijah only had a brief moment to notice its unusual size and slavering jaws before he was forced to react. The bear crashed into him, raking its claws across his shoulders. Elijah screamed in pain, swinging his hatchet instinctively. Despite his panic, his aim was true, and the hatchet found its way to the bear's snout. However, the small axe wasn't a real weapon, and under the influence of Elijah's enhanced strength, after all, he was already operating a peak human level, and that was further augmented by one with nature. The hatchet's stone blade shattered into pieces. But it served the purpose of startling his attacker, and the creature reared back in pain and surprise. Elijah used that opportunity to kick out, his bare feet barely capable of pushing the bear off balance. By that point, he'd managed to regain some of his wits, and he used them to guide Ethera into grasping roots, binding the off-balance bear into place. Elijah scrambled back in a panicked crab walk made even more awkward than normal by the death grip he had on his staff. Once he was a few feet away, he channeled more Ethera into Storm's fury, pushing it through the staff of natural harmony. When he released the spell, a thick, blue bolt of lightning arced out, hitting the struggling black bear in the chest. The smell of charred flesh and burned hair filled the air as the bear let out a roar of furious agony. Elijah ignored it, dragging Ethera from his core and pushing it through his soul until the spell was charged once again. He let it loose, and another bolt of lightning hit the monstrous bear. Then he did it again. And again. over and over until, by the 10th cast, the animal had been reduced to a twisting mass of dead flesh and charred fur. Elijah sat there, panting in that curious exhaustion that seemed to come after every life or death experience. His muscles shook, and his heart was beating out of control, a feeling that he'd only experienced twice before. Once, when he'd first learned that the cancer he'd been told was completely treatable was, in fact, terminal. And then once again after the death of the Vox monster that had nearly killed him and the panther. Slowly, Elijah got his thoughts back under control, and he studied his vanquished foe. The bear was far larger than a black bear should have been, but that didn't explain its aggressive behavior. Bear attacks weren't completely unheard of, but this was different from a creature protecting its cubs or territory. For one, the thing was male, so the first excuse didn't seem applicable. And second, Elijah had found that, with nature, most animals would simply ignore him unless he attacked them first. But this bear had instigated the encounter. That, coupled with its unrestrained aggression, suggested that something was wrong. That suspicion was further supported when Elijah drew the stone-bladed knife that he'd secured to his waist via a makeshift belt woven from his homemade cordage and sliced into the bear's flesh. When he did, he saw that the expected red muscle was laced with black tendrils of what could only be called corruption. It reminded Elijah of the Vox, though he wasn't sure why he was so certain that it was related. It was just a feeling, but one he couldn't ignore. After a little more inspection, he saw that the bear's eyes were clouded and milky white, and its saliva was flecked with fresh blood, almost as if it had been rabid. But even though his specialty had been marine life, Elijah had enough experience with land mammals to know that whatever had afflicted the bear hadn't been something as mundane as rabies. It was corruption, and given what he'd seen of the Vox, it wasn't difficult to make the intuitive leap that they were the cause. Still, he didn't even know if such a thing was possible. For all Elijah knew, it was just another strange mutation foisted upon the world by the touch of the world tree. After all, if crabs could suddenly grow hundreds of times larger, then an aggressive black bear wasn't so far outside the realm of possibility that it could be completely discounted, regardless of Elijah's suspicions regarding corruption by the Vox. He needed confirmation, and the only way he was going to get it was to ask Nerthus. But first, he needed to heal the gashes in his chest. So, he channeled Ethera through his soul and into touch of nature. The wounds weren't too deep, so it only took 2 casts to mend his flesh. However, that ended up draining his core dry, so he had no choice but to wait a few minutes before he'd gathered enough Ethera to fuel the teleportation portion of Ancestral Circle. When he finally cast the spell, it was as if one moment he was in the forest, and after a blink he was back in the grove. He'd used it a few times of late. Without the ability to return to the grove at will, his exploration would have been much slower, but Elijah didn't think he'd ever get used to the feeling. Once he'd reoriented himself, he approached the ancestral tree where he called out to Nerthus, who grew out of the trunk only a few moments later. Once he was fully present, Elijah explained the situation, then asked, "What do you think it is?" "I thought it felt like the Vox, but I figured I'd ask before I jumped to any definitive conclusions." Nerthus nodded. "Your instincts were correct," he said. "There must be a portal nearby. I knew there had to be at least one in the surrounding waters, but this is troubling." Then, Nerthus explained how the existence of portals, dimensional rifts through which the Vox could invade, had a corrupting influence on non-sentient life. Then, he said, "Fortunately, it seems to be a small one." "How do you know?" "If it was of significant size, the system would have contained it with a tower." "If that were the case, we would know," Nerthus stated. "Because it is small, you should be able to take care of it." "What? And why me?" Elijah asked. "Because you are the protector of the grove," Nerthus answered. "It is a simple process. You must find the dimensional tier, enter it, and defeat the guardian. Once you have done so, you will gain a boon from the system. And you think I'm capable of that?" "I'm only level 7, Elijah stated. "With your cultivation, you are much more powerful than your level," Nerthus said. "In any case, you wish to get stronger, correct? This is how you will do so." Elijah sighed. That much was true, and the existence of these portals, or towers, if they were larger, suggested a reason for why the others on the ladder had grown so powerful. It was also gratifying to know that his cultivation meant that he was stronger than he might appear. But in the end, Elijah knew he didn't have much choice. This was his island, and according to Nerthus's explanation, if the portal was left unchecked, its influence would grow until it enveloped the entire area. So, unless he wanted to run away, an impossibility because he didn't think crossing the strait was a good idea and because doing so would mean abandoning his grove, he was stuck with dealing with it. Fine, he said. Any advice? Nerthus cocked his head to the side, then said, try not to die. Your protection is needed if the grove is meant to reach its potential. Elijah shook his head, then said, thanks, I guess. I'll try to find it tomorrow, then. Elijah spent the rest of the day preparing his mind for what was coming. Nerthus couldn't tell him much about what he could expect to find on the other side of the dimensional portal, so he'd chosen the route of pessimism. Judging by his experiences with the Vox and the corrupted bear, he thought expecting the worst was likely appropriate. That night, he slept fitfully, and not just because he still wasn't used to sleeping under the open sky. Instead, his imagination had gone wild, conjuring one terrible setting after another until he felt like he was going to go mad. So, when morning dawned, he was more than ready to get things over with. First, though, he had to find the portal. So, he returned to where he'd fought the bear, only to find that it had almost entirely rotted away during the night. All that was left were a few clumps of black fur and a couple of puddles of a semi-solid slurry of flesh, blood, and corruption. The sight nearly made Elijah vomit, but he barely managed to keep his breakfast of berries and mushrooms from coming back up. From there, he began his search. The island was only so big, but even with its limited size, the search proved frustrating, and it didn't bear fruit until 4 hours later when he felt something amiss. One with nature was a versatile spell, giving him augmented physical ability as well as giving him a watered-down connection with his surroundings. And it was via this sense that he found the first tendril of seeping corruption. Pinpointing it was difficult, but the general direction was not. So, he picked his way through the forest, keeping that sickening corruption firmly in his senses. And when he stumbled across it, he once again felt the need to vomit. This time, though, he didn't manage to push through it, and he soon found himself heaving the contents of his stomach onto the forest floor. The tendril wasn't all that noticeable, not to mundane senses. However, to the feelings that had come with his archetype, it was like bathing in raw sewage. To call it disgusting would have been underselling the repulsiveness to an extreme degree. When he looked around the meandering tendril of black rot snaking across the ground, Elijah felt like he had maggots burrowing into his skin. But he pushed his disgust aside and followed the trail for a few dozen yards, and with each step, he felt the corruption more keenly until, at last, he found the source. It was a gaping rip in the very fabric of reality. With jagged edges of glowing purple light and a center of pitch black, it looked completely out of place amidst the verdant forest. Elijah took a deep breath that he regretted after being assailed by another wave of nausea. He wanted nothing more than to simply turn around and flee the alien thing. But he couldn't. He refused to back away. Not only because he really didn't have a choice, but also because he didn't want to be the kind of man who ran from his responsibilities. He never had been, and he wasn't going to start now that the world had changed either. So, after resolutely squaring his shoulders, Elijah stepped forward, his staff at the ready, and strode through the portal. When he used the teleportation function of Ancestral Circle, it was no more uncomfortable than blinking. So, he'd expected that going through the portal would be somewhat similar. However, that expectation couldn't have been further from reality. For an instant, Elijah felt like he was being ripped into a million pieces and from every direction. Then, suddenly, the pain ceased and he fell to the ground. For a long moment, Elijah knelt on one knee, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Even the memory of that agony was enough to spike his heart rate. But over the next couple of seconds, even that faded away until he felt completely normal. That's when he took a moment to study his surroundings. The ground was bare, black stone, jagged and so shiny that it reminded him of obsidian. He looked up and when he saw the alien landscape, Elijah couldn't stop himself from gasping. Huge peaks of gray rock stood against a black sky crisscrossed with rivers of deep purple energy. By itself, that alien atmosphere was enough to tell Elijah that he was no longer on Earth. but the terrain was just as peculiar. The obsidian-like rock extended for 30 yards in every direction, but beyond that was lifeless gray stone. The only color came from what looked like purple anemones, their appendages waving in the motionless atmosphere. But Elijah only had eyes for the hulking creature 20 feet away. In some ways, it resembled the scaled monster that had attacked him what felt like a lifetime before. However, where that creature's scales had shimmered with a green-blue luster, this new monster was black with purple markings running along its muscular shoulders. It was also much smaller, only topping Elijah's compact frame by a few inches. But with its bulging muscles, it was much heavier than him. It let out a hissing growl, staring at him with all 4 of its eyes. Had the other one possessed 4 eyes? Elijah couldn't remember. His fingers tightened around the staff of natural harmony, and he held it before him. If everything went right, the monster wouldn't get anywhere near him. He just needed to keep his wits about him, and everything would be fine. But as much as he wanted to believe that, it was difficult to keep it in mind when facing off against a monster out of his worst nightmares. It shifted forward, its muscles rippling beneath its scales as it dropped to all 4s, like a gorilla. Then, without any further delay, it sprang forward. The thing exploded into motion so quickly that Elijah had no time to channel Ethera into grasping roots. Instead, all he could do was dive to the side, narrowly avoiding the monster's pounce. Even so, jagged rocks ripped at Elijah's bare shoulder as he rolled to safety. He managed to keep a grip on his staff, and by the time he reached his feet, he'd channeled enough Ethera into the spell. Roots, thick and purple, with 3-inch thorns erupted from the ground and snaked around the monster's legs. It yanked its limbs free, tearing the roots from the rocky ground. However, the moment one root was destroyed, 3 more took its place. And after only a second, the monster's entire lower half was mired in a quagmire of alien vegetation. That was the difference his soul cultivation and the staff of natural harmony had made. Before, the roots were flimsy and easily broken, but now he could pour enough Ethera into the spell that it was a much more formidable obstruction. But Elijah knew it wouldn't last forever. So he switched his focus to Storm's Fury, channeling as much Ethera as he could into the spell. In the second it took him to saturate the spell, the monster had begun to break loose. And if it managed that feat before he released the spell, Elijah knew he was doomed. Just as it freed one leg, he loosed the spell and purple lightning ripped forth, tearing a path from his staff to the black-scaled creature. With a crack of thunder, it punched the monster so hard that it was sent staggering backward. But even more importantly, that purple lightning raced through its body, leaving devastation in its wake. Elijah wasn't finished. Even as the monster convulsed, he charged another spell, releasing it just as the effects of the first faded. This time, the results were even more destructive, and by the time Elijah finished casting his third spell, the creature's flesh was smoking. But Elijah refused to let up. 7 more times he cast Storm's Fury, never letting the monster recover or regain its feet. And when his Ethera ran dry, it was completely still. It wasn't dead though. Elijah still hadn't gotten any sort of notification from the system, which meant that, for all the punishment he'd sent its way, it wasn't dead. And that was a problem because Elijah's core was almost completely empty. He had just enough Ethera to fuel a heal, but not enough to use Storm's Fury. And that meant he'd have to do things manually. Elijah drew his stone-bladed knife before stalking forward. The jagged ground threatened to cut into his feet, but months of walking around barefoot had inured him to such discomfort. So, staff in one hand and knife in the other, he slowly approached the prone monster. The closer he drew, the worse it smelled, but he steeled himself against the disgust bubbling in his stomach. Once he got close enough, he levered his staff under the creature's stomach and flipped it over. And for his trouble, he got a claw to the stomach. It happened so quickly that Elijah had no chance to react. 1 second, the thing was completely inert, and the next, it was springing forward with flashing claws. Elijah stumbled, and the monster pounced on top of him. Luckily, Elijah had kept a grip on his weapons, and he managed to get his knife up just in time. Even more fortunately, the hardened scales on its stomach had been melted to such a degree that they offered little protection against even so pitiful a weapon as his knife. It sank deep even as Elijah blocked its snapping jaws with his staff. The wood held firm, and the knife bit into the creature's vitals, ripping them apart without issue. Elijah's arm pumped, repeatedly stabbing into the monster's stomach. It wasn't idle, though. No, it flailed and bit, ripped and clawed, but Elijah had steeled his will and cultivated his body, which barely allowed him to survive long enough to destroy something vital. And then, suddenly, the strength went out of the creature's powerful muscles and it collapsed atop him. With strength enhanced by the system, his body cultivation, and one with nature, Elijah barely managed to push the creature aside. And as soon as he did, he pulsed touch of nature, partially healing the wounds he'd taken. He tried to cast the spell again, but his core was entirely dry. So, as he lay there, waiting for his Ethera to recover, Elijah considered the fight. He couldn't think of anything he could have done differently, save for having better weapons or more Ethera. But even so, he'd only barely managed to survive. One less storm's fury, and he wouldn't have been able to punch through its scales. One misstep, and he'd have been ripped to pieces. It was a grim reminder of just how little power he really had. Regardless of how much he'd advanced, and he felt that he'd done well with the situation he'd been given, he still had a long way to go. But the notification he got after killing the monster was going to be a good start. Congratulations! You have reached level 8, earning 2 free attribute points. Would you like to allocate free attribute points? Elijah did, adding 2 points to Ethera. It didn't seem like much, but if he'd had a couple extra casts of Storm's Fury, he might not have had to kill the monster by hand. Or maybe it wouldn't have made any difference at all. He had no way of knowing. Not for the first time, he found himself wishing things were a little clearer. Perhaps if everyone had health points, like in a video game, things would have made a little more sense. As far as he could tell, though, even things like the relative value of his attributes didn't follow much logic. For instance, the points he'd spent in Ethera didn't result in a linear progression in terms of how many times he could cast his spells. The only quantifiable correlation was that more points meant more casts. Perhaps his cultivation threw things off. Or maybe it just wasn't linear. He had no way to know. Such thoughts occupied his mind until he recovered enough Ethera to once again cast Touch of Nature, which, when channeled through his staff, was enough to push him to perfect health. After that, he pushed himself to his feet and looked around for the exit. The portal through which he'd entered was nowhere to be seen, but in its place was a floating white crystal. When he looked upon it, he felt a draw unlike anything he'd ever felt. He needed to touch it. The need was so overwhelming that it completely abolished any sense of choice. He never even considered resisting it. Elijah walked forward and laid his hand upon its smooth surface. Instantly, the alien landscape disappeared, replaced by a void, as if he floated between realities. It would have been maddening if it didn't feel so right. Another notification bloomed in his mind's eye. Congratulations! By closing a minor dimensional rift, you have done a great service to your world. Thus, you have earned a reward. Lesser Attribute Potion awarded. Elijah didn't have a chance to wonder what that meant before he was whisked away back to reality. An instant later, he was back in the forest, though when he looked around, the portal and tendrils of corruption were gone. And in his hand was a small vial containing a glowing blue liquid. Without a doubt, it was the potion awarded by the system. Perhaps it would have been smart to wait, to investigate more. But the system had yet to lie, so he unhesitatingly popped the stopper off the vial, then appended the contents down his throat. When he swallowed, he felt a budding warmth in the pit of his stomach, then received another notification. You have consumed a lesser attribute potion, receiving 3 free attribute points. Would you like to allocate free attribute points? Elijah pumped his fist. It was precisely what he'd hoped for, and he quickly allocated his points, pushing 2 into Ethera and bringing it 15. The final point he allocated into regeneration, bringing it to 13 total points. Elijah Hart, level archetype, Druid, class, not applicable. Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, 10. Dexterity, 10. Constitution, 11. 15. Regeneration, 13. Movement, nature, cultivation, body, formed, neophyte. His reasoning was simple. He fully intended to spread his attribute points across each category on his status. However, for now, his spells were his most potent means of survival, so he intended to enhance the relevant attributes until he felt comfortable with where he was. Then he'd push points into his physical attributes. Once that was done, Elijah headed back to the grove. He wished he could use Ancestral Circle to teleport back, but the spell had a significant cooldown that still hadn't lapsed. So, he was forced to go back on foot. Still, it wasn't an arduous journey, and soon enough, he was back in familiar territory. I know it's not a new PlayStation, but happy birthday. Miguel looked down at the weapon in his hands. It was a compound bow not unlike the one Roman still carried, but it had been made from scratch by Carmen. The same could be said for the wide variety of arrows in the paired quiver. Alyssa and Carmen had gone back and forth trying to decide on an appropriate gift for Miguel's birthday. In the past, he'd usually gotten various electronics, games, or toys like Legos. But the world had changed, and not only were those things unavailable, but it was also irresponsible to devote any significant time to such frivolous pursuits. Still, they wanted their son to have a childhood, or whatever passed for one in the new world. So, in addition to the bow, they'd given him some homemade toys and scavenged board games. None were in perfect condition, but they were the best Alyssa could gather. The young boy's face lit up, and he exclaimed, "I love it." Then, he threw himself at Carmen, wrapping his arms around her as he profusely thanked his mother. Then, he did the same for Alyssa, announcing that he was going to be a marksman, just like Uncle Roman. Carmen tousled his hair, then told him to go outside and practice. He'd already been taught the basics of the weapon, all of the settlement's children had, and he was eager to test it out. So, he quickly scurried from the small cottage that Carmen had built, intent on following his mother's instructions. That left the two women alone. The moment he was gone, Alyssa's shoulders sagged. Carmen put her arm around the slender woman's shoulders and hugged her close as she said, "This was the right decision. Everything we've seen suggests that people get archetypes based on their past experiences. Being a marksman will keep him off the front lines. It's a strong option." Alyssa shook her head. "I just wish it wasn't necessary," she stated. It was a useless sentiment. As she well knew, the world had been irrevocably transformed, and there was nothing she could do about it. What she could do was prepare her son to thrive, at least as much as possible. Leaning into Carmen, she thought about how far they'd come. It had been a difficult winter, and more than a few people hadn't made it. Some had starved. Others had passed away due to exposure. But most of the casualties had come at the hands of the wildlife. Most of the monsters they encountered were clearly mutated versions of Earth animals, but there were other, less natural creatures, like the bat monkeys they'd had to clear out of the station. But deadliest of all were the scaled monsters like the one that had killed Trish and Tony. Fortunately, they hadn't encountered any others nearly that powerful. If they had, the settlement wouldn't have made it. But the ones they had fought were just as dangerous, especially considering that they often targeted people much less powerful than Alyssa. And the results had been predictable. To date, they'd lost almost 24 hunters and gatherers to the scaled monsters. But there was hope. The night that Trish had died, Alyssa had gained the ability to choose a class, and since then, 10 others had done the same. It was slow going, but if everyone gained a class, there was a chance that they could stand up to the monsters. So, even if there was hope for their continual survival, it was tempered by the reality of their losses. Still, with spring had come solutions to some of their problems. A few of the scholars had planted some crops, and a couple of the tradesmen had figured out how to get power from scavenged solar panels. The yield wasn't nearly what it should have been, but it was progress. In short, after a hellish beginning to the end of the world, things had begun to look up. It was all different, but Alyssa thought they'd survived the worst of it. Or at least she hoped so. "How is Roman?" asked Carmen. Alyssa sighed. "Outwardly, he's fine," she said. "He's doing everything right, and I think people recognize that. But he's still not over what happened to Trish." "Who would be?" asked Carmen. It had been months, but the healer's death still weighed heavily on the settlement's leader. "I don't know. The problem isn't that he's still grieving. People expect that. It would humanize him. But he doesn't let it show. For all everyone knows, he just kept going like normal. Meanwhile, only those of us who really know him can see just how much he's hurting." "I don't know what to do," she admitted. I don't know how to help. It's not your responsibility, Carmen reminded her. He's a grown man. If he doesn't want to address it, there's not really anything you can do. Alyssa sighed, then pushed away from her wife's embrace. Standing, she said, I know that. But I can't help but feel, I don't know. He doesn't blame you, does he? Asked Carmen. Alyssa shook her head. No. I don't think so, at least. Maybe? I don't know. I blame myself, though. That's stupid. You couldn't have done anything differently, Carmen said without a hint of hesitation. You did what you could. I know you don't want to hear this, but Trish was never cut out for this world. You saw that on the first day when she almost got killed. She was always going to end up. Just then, there was a knock at the door, cutting Carmen off. Their cottage only had 3 rooms, a common area and a pair of bedrooms, but each space was incredibly small. So, it only took Alyssa 2 steps to reach the door. When she opened it, she saw Fiona, who'd established herself in a position of some prominence after what had happened in the cabin. Since then, she'd become the highest-leveled mage type, and she'd distinguished herself on more than one occasion. More importantly, she was Roman's right-hand woman. The chief needs you, she said. Looking past Alyssa at Carmen, she said, Both of you? For what? Fiona shrugged. No idea. He just said it's important, was her response, though Alyssa got the feeling that even if Fiona had known, she wouldn't have let loose with the information. She wasn't precisely hostile, but she wasn't friendly either. All right, let's go then. After letting Miguel know what was going on, the trio set off across the settlement. It had grown quite a bit, and the area surrounding the old police station now featured dozens of buildings and other homes. Most weren't more elaborate than 4 walls and a roof, but a few were a little more complex. It was further evidence that people had begun to adjust to the new world, especially considering that they'd started to move past the scarcity-induced policies of collective survival and into an economy based on barter. The various tradesmen had begun to hawk their wares, and, as a result, better weapons, armor, and other goods had taken a leap forward. For her part, Alyssa favored the spear, largely because of the class she'd received at level 10. She'd had a host of options, but none seemed quite as powerful as the one she had chosen. As they walked, she looked at her class's description. Class, Dragon Lancer. A powerful lancer meant to combat and kill the most dangerous foes. Required archetype. Required achievements. Slay a much more powerful creature with a spear or lance. Garner the loyalty of at least 20 people. First ability. Descending Dragon. Attribute allocation. Physical. Compatibility. 97%. She'd gained a couple of levels since then, and her attributes had experienced a huge jump with each level. She had also gotten 3 new abilities: Descending Dragon, Heart of the Dragon, and Heroic Leap. At first, she'd considered Descending Dragon a niche ability, but upon reaching level 12 and gaining Heroic Leap, the synergy of the 2 abilities had forced her to re-evaluate. Heroic Leap was just what the name implied, and it allowed her to leap much higher and travel faster through the air than her attributes would normally allow. On its own, it was a useful way to close with her enemies, and it gave her far more mobility than she could have otherwise expected. However, where it really shone was when paired with Descending Dragon. Descending Dragon. Fall upon an enemy, dealing more damage based on distance fallen. Protected from falling damage while ability is active. Alyssa had no way to gauge precisely how much damage she could do with the ability, but she did know that she could obliterate normal beasts, so long as she used Descending Dragon at the apex of a heroic leap. If her timing was off, the resulting blow would be less powerful. As for Heart of the Dragon, it temporarily enhanced her attributes. In a way, it was similar to Enrage, but the effect was far less potent. The other differences were more important, though. Not only did it last longer, but it didn't come with Enrage's fury, allowing her to keep her wits about her. Before the trio reached their destination, she checked her status as well. Alyssa Heart. Level 12. Archetype. Class. Dragon Lancer. Specialization. Not applicable. Alignment. Not applicable. Strength. 16. Dexterity. 12. Constitution. 12. 7. Regeneration. 7. Movement. Cultivation. Body. Formed. Unlike the first 10 levels, after choosing her class, Alyssa's attribute allocation was automatic, and she'd gain 2 points in strength as well as 1 each in dexterity and constitution per level. She worried a little about her low regeneration and Ethera attributes, but at the moment, there wasn't much she could do about it. Perhaps she could figure it out sometime in the future, though. After all, she suspected that, at some point, she'd choose a specialization, which would likely give her more options for improvement. There was also the question of the 4 aspects of cultivation to worry about. No one had figured out what any of that meant, but she expected it would only be a matter of time before they did. Soon, the group reached the central building that had once been the police station. It looked much the same as it always did, though construction had begun to add additional floors. With the abilities granted by the tradesman archetype, the architects of that plan had promised that it would soon be completed. One of them had even confessed that he envisioned a future where it grew to the size of a skyscraper. Alyssa thought the man, named Toby, was a bit off in the head, but Carmen had insisted that it was theoretically possible, especially if one of the other tradesmen reached level 10 and took something like an architect class. For her part, Carmen had chosen the blacksmith class when she'd been offered the opportunity at level 10. She was the only member of the craftsman population to have reached such heights, but there were a few others who were snapping at the heels of her progress. Once they entered the building, they had to pass through what had become a makeshift market/headquarters, where people tried to organize the settlement's supplies, defense, and gathering missions. It was a mess, but the building was easily the most secure location within the settlement, and so, it was the natural choice for such operations. Soon, the trio found their way to the second level, where they passed a few old offices on their way to the one Roman had claimed. When they entered, Alyssa found her mind drifting back to what felt like ancient history. Roman looked much the same as he always did, which was to say he was lean, broad-shouldered, and dark-haired. But his face bore a few extra lines, no doubt due to worrying about all the people who'd entrusted him with their security. The office, though, was almost identical to what it had been before the world had transformed. The same photos, the same old football memorabilia, the same hunting trophies. It was like stepping out of a time machine. Beside the great wooden slab of a desk was a man Alyssa vaguely recognized, though she couldn't remember his name. "What's up, Chief?" she asked. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the trio of chairs across from him. "We need to talk about something important." Alyssa did as he bade, though she had to keep herself from wilting under the intensity of his gaze. She knew he didn't blame her for the death of his wife, but that didn't help much with her guilt. As a result, she found it difficult to look him in the eye. Carmen had no such issues, and she plopped down in the chair, throwing her arm over the back in a display of comfort Alyssa wished she could emulate. Fiona took a seat as well, looking like Carmen's exact opposite. Where Carmen's muscles had only grown larger and more defined, Fiona looked like she would blow away at the first hint of a breeze. "Who's the stiff?" Carmen asked, gesturing to the man. "Derek or something, right?" He adjusted his glasses and said, "Dirk, actually. Sorry, I'm terrible with names." "So, what's going on, boss?" asked Carmen. "Right," Roman said. "Dirk here is a scholar who just reached level 10. Okay? He's not the first," said Alyssa. Indeed, there had been a couple of other scholars who'd managed to climb to level 10. One had taken a horticulturist class, while the other had become an administrator. But both had other choices like banker, teacher, and philosopher. It had become common practice to respect people's choices in regards to archetypes, but it was an undeniable fact that most of the townspeople looked down on scholars because they offered little in terms of immediate survival. Some had found niches where they could be of use, but quite a few were nothing more than inferior laborers. There was even some sentiment that towns should cease providing for them, and if they weren't already ingrained in the burgeoning society, the idea would have probably gotten a little more traction. Roman had given voice to the idea on more than one occasion, though never where anyone but his inner circle, including Alyssa, could hear. "He has a unique class choice," Roman said. Then he told Dirk, "Go ahead. Tell them." The bespectacled man once again adjusted his glasses, then cleared his throat before saying, "Right. So, it's called Envoy of the World Tree. The description is, you have been chosen to represent the cult of the World Tree. Doing so will legitimize your settlement and grant limited access to the network. What the hell does that mean? Alyssa asked. That's a damned good question, Roman answered. Dirk? I don't know. Not precisely. But you know how you kind of get an idea of what a class entails before you pick it, he asked. They all had progressed past level 10, so they nodded. Well, I get the impression that this one is, I don't know, necessary. How so? Asked Fiona, her first contribution. I have no idea. I just think it can help us survive somehow. The network sounds like it might be some means of communication, right? So, maybe it will let us call for help? Roman said, that's what worries me. Carmen asked, calling for help? Alyssa answered before Roman did, saying, it could be dangerous. I know we haven't had much trouble with would-be warlords and the like, but we'd be stupid to assume they don't exist out there. Someone gets a little power and then, well, you know how it goes. It's been the same throughout human history. There are always people out there who will abuse power to enslave or oppress everyone else. And with everything else, I mean, does anyone here think there aren't bad actors out there? If we start calling for help, we might put a target on our backs. Exactly, Roman said. Still, we can't ignore this. For all we know, we're completely wrong about how this works. I think we have to do it, said Carmen. Fiona agreed, we can't ignore a chance like this. We're already on the verge of ruin. Maybe this network will give us a chance to do more than just survive. Roman nodded. I was thinking the same thing. So, Dirk, we're going to need you to take the class. But don't do anything else, okay? Not until we know what we're dealing with. Dirk nodded. All right, here it goes. Nothing happened, at least not outwardly, but Dirk's eyes briefly glazed over. It only lasted a second or two before he refocused. It's done, he said. Well, that was anticlimactic, said Carmen, who, like everyone else, was on the edge of her seat after Dirk took the class. That's it? What kind of ability did you get? Not an ability, he said. The spell? Yeah. What's it called? She asked. It's called Branch of the World Tree, Dirk answered. It says that it imbues a crystal with a connection to the World Tree network. A crystal? What kind of crystal? Asked Roman. You think I know? Dirk responded. I'm just as much in the dark as you are. Alyssa said, Duh. So, it seems we need to find a crystal. Any ideas where to find one? How big? Asked Carmen. Everyone looked at Dirk, who clearly did not like the attention. He said, I have no idea. As large as we can find, I suppose. I think I've got something that will work, Carmen said. Really? What? Asked Alyssa. You remember that trophy we found last month? She answered. You know, the one with the giant golf ball? You kept that? She shrugged. It's sparkly. Alyssa was about to respond, but then thought better of it. Instead, she just rolled her eyes. Carmen had always been something of a pack rat. Rarely did she encounter anything she wanted to toss out, and that clearly extended to the gaudy golf trophy they had found in one of the small town's more affluent houses. Plus, I thought I could reshape it, she said in a small voice. Maybe into a dolphin. A dolphin? You do have a birthday coming up, Carmen said, blushing. And you like dolphins? Before Alyssa could respond to her wife's admission, Fiona cleared her throat and said, as heartwarming as this is, can we get on with it? Where is this crystal? And if you can reshape it, why not do it in something that's, not a golf ball? I could just do a generic crystal, Carmen stated. She glanced at Dirk as she continued, like a faceted gem. She held her hands about 8 inches apart, adding, about that big. Think that'd work? I guess? Maybe. I don't know. You are tons of help, Carmen said. Anyone ever tell you that? Helpful Dirk. That's what I'm going to start calling. Enough, Carmen, said Roman. He's doing everything he can. Carmen started to respond, probably in a not-so-courteous way. So Alyssa grabbed her by the arm and tugged her away as she said, Come on. Let's go get that crystal. Where do you want us to meet you? In the lobby, Roman said. 10-4, Chief, Alyssa acknowledged, pulling Carmen out the door. A few minutes later, the pair were in the small storehouse beside Carmen's forge, where she was muttering under her breath while searching through her materials. Eventually, she found the trophy, a gaudy thing that Alyssa couldn't believe anyone had ever commissioned, behind a bundle of iron rods. Carmen easily pulled the dimpled sphere free of base of the trophy, then tossed the faux marble aside. "All right," she said. "You might want to look away." Alyssa was well accustomed to Carmen's process. She had an ability she could use once a week that allowed her to reshape materials only using her hands. Aside from the significant cooldown, the other major downside was that it created a light bright enough to blind most normal people. To protect herself, Carmen pulled on a pair of old welding goggles, then used the ability. Even with her back turned, Alyssa saw stars, and that was just from the indirect light. She couldn't imagine looking at it directly. After a couple of minutes, Carmen announced, "Alright, I think that's the best I can do. Sucks I had to waste my cooldown on something like this, but whatever. For the greater good, right?" "For the greater good," Alyssa echoed, grinning slightly as she turned to face her wife. In Carmen's hands was an oblong gem, faceted like a cut diamond. "Oh, pretty. Would have been better as a dolphin. You know I don't even like dolphins, right?" "Sure you do. You had all those figurines. Because they were my mom's." "Wait, really? Really? You mean I bought you that ridiculous dolphin blanket for nothing? And those matching slippers? They were cute, yes, and warm, which was the main purpose? God, don't worry about it. It's the thought that counts. That's what people say when they get shitty gifts," Carmen pointed out. "What, yeah, but, I mean and moving right along. Probably for the best," Alyssa acknowledged. "Come on. Roman's waiting on us." "He can wait for all I care," groused Carmen. She'd never liked being at anyone's beck and call, which was why she had sought a field where she didn't really have to answer to anyone. Notably, she followed Alyssa anyway. After all, like her wife, Carmen suspected that Dirk's spell would probably be important for the settlement's development. It only took a couple of minutes for the pair to get back to the lobby, where they found the other three. Roman directed Carmen to set the crystal atop a stool someone had hunted down. When she did just that, they all stepped back, and Roman said to Dirk, "Alright, do your thing." Dirk stepped forward and held out his hand. As he did, he said, "I really hate that you're all staring at me." "Just do it," said Fiona. He sighed, scrunched up his face, and laid his hand on the crystal. A second later, Alyssa felt something in the air move before the crystal lit up with blue light. Then, it started to morph, tendrils of the crystal growing downward to wrap around the stool. At the same time, the rest of the structure elongated before growing more tendrils. "It looks like a tree." Alyssa glanced at Carmen, then back at the glowing crystal. The moment Carmen had said as much, Alyssa saw it as well. And with every passing second, it grew clearer until, at last, the blue light faded. When it did, a crystalline tree was revealed. It was maybe 6 feet tall, with leafless branches stretching the same distance from the trunk. "What now?" asked Carmen. "I don't." Suddenly, someone new appeared before them. And everyone reacted with predictable aggression. Carmen pulled a hammer from thin air, and Alyssa yanked a dagger from the sheath at her waist. Meanwhile, Roman, who'd taken the assassin class, disappeared completely. When he reappeared a moment later, he had a pair of knives in hand. Dirk was the only one who didn't move at all. "Oh, isn't this embarrassing?" said the woman as a throwing knife passed right through her. "I suppose you didn't expect me to show up, huh?" "What are you?" demanded Roman. It was a valid question, considering that the woman was clearly inhuman, with light green skin, pointed ears, and hair that looked more like vines than any tresses that Alyssa had ever seen. She wore a thin robe that left very little to the imagination. "I guess you don't have wood elves here," she said. "No matter." She cleared her throat, then straightened her back. "I am Numa, and I am a representative of the cult of the World Tree. You would know all about that, I'm sure." "No," said Dirk. "What, really? Why did you take the class, then?" Numa asked. "They made me." "We didn't make you," Carmen barked. "We suggested." "This is a nice place you have here," said Numa, looking around. "Very chic." "Oh, I'm sorry that it's not up to your standards," Carmen stated. "We've been a little too busy dealing with the fucking apocalypse to worry about making everything all nice and shiny." "Apocalypse?" "This is a newly integrated world. That explains so much," she said. "In that case, welcome. Your world has been connected to the rest of the universe via the majesty of the World Tree." As an official settlement, you now have access to a host of features based on the level of your envoy. He's level 10, said Alyssa. What does that get us? Alright. Not much, I'm afraid. You get access to the banking system, limited trade, and, well, that's it. But if he reaches level 50, you will unlock the teleportation system, she said. So, that's something to look forward to, right? We also have guides on a variety of subjects, classes, and, of course, cultivation methods. For a price, obviously. Alyssa addressed the obvious concern, saying, I'm guessing you don't take dollars. What currency are we using here? Precious metals? Gems? We don't have much, but Ethereum, of course. What the hell is Ethereum? Solidified Ethera in the shape of coins, she said, holding up a small, circular object the size of a $50. Copper is the lowest denomination, and it's denoted by a, copper color. Then silver. Gold after that. And finally, platinum. It takes 1,000 copper to add up to a silver, 1,000 silver to amount to the same value as 1 gold Ethereum, then 1,000,000 gold coins to equal a single platinum. Most people only deal in copper and silver coins. And where do we get these coins? I don't suppose there's a class with a mint ability, right? Said Fiona. Certainly not, said Numa with an indulgent smile. Alyssa didn't like how condescending the wood elf was, but then again, she probably had every right to be. As far as Numa was concerned, they were backwards savages. It didn't matter that they'd had their world turned upside down. Their lives were primitive by anyone's measure. The answer to your question is the branch of the world tree. You merely need to touch it, and you will gain access to the banking system. We don't have anything to deposit, said Carmen. Oh, but you don't understand. Of course you don't, she said with a patient tone that reminded Alyssa of the way a kindergarten teacher would talk to a class full of 5-year-olds. That's okay. Each time you kill a hostile creature, it marks you. When you access the branch of the world tree, it reads those marks and rewards you appropriately. For instance, if you kill a reasonably weak creature, you might be credited with a single copper Ethereum. The more powerful the enemy, the higher the reward. And, of course, defeating one of the Vox is even more valuable. Vox? Oh dear. You don't know about the Vox. Obviously, Carmen muttered. The Vox are denizens of another reality, Numa said. They infiltrate our universe via dimensional rifts. Some of those rifts are only active for long enough to admit a single Vox. However, others remain in place until someone goes in and closes them. Then there are the towers, which can be divided into different grades of difficulty. Finally, there are primal realms, though I doubt you need to worry about those right now. Alyssa nodded along as Numa explained it, and once the elf was finished, she asked, So, we use those coins to buy the stuff you were talking about. What form does it take? And how does it arrive? I don't understand, Numa said. Then her already huge eyes widened and she said, I get it now. The information will be presented in the form of leaves, which will grow from this tree. Pluck them, and you will be able to read their contents? Alyssa realized then that she would get far more information by testing it out rather than relying on Numa's explanations. So, she stepped forward and asked, I just put my hand on it? Yes. Go ahead, the elven woman prompted with another condescending smile. Alyssa suppressed the urge to roll her eyes, then put her hand on one of the crystalline branches. Immediately a new window flashed before her eyes. Copper, silver, platinum. 732. 7. Sir. Okay, said Alyssa. I guess I have a little over 7 silver Ethereum. What can I get for that? 7? How? You're the expert, she said. So, what can I get? For now, you're limited to our basic guides. However, those should be quite sufficient for your current level of advancement, Numa informed her. Okay? How do I access them? After that, Numa walked her through the process. It boiled down to simply thinking the word, market, which pulled up the available guides. The wood elf also taught her how to access the other features of the branch, but all of those were grayed out. Most, she couldn't even identify because they were hidden. Still, she selected a dozen different guides, exhausting the limits of her currency. A few of them were for Carmen, and they detailed different crafting methods. However, the ones that really excited Alyssa were the ones meant to teach her about cultivation. I think this is going to change everything, Alyssa said, pulling away. The elf gave her an indulgent smile, saying, "Of course. That's the point.